King Adolf Frederick. What's the worst food coma you've ever had? Maybe a Thanksgiving dinner that left you lying on the couch, regretting every bite. Well, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden takes the crown, literally, for the deadliest food coma in history. Adolf Frederick was king of Sweden in the 1700s, and by most accounts, he wasn't exactly a fearsome ruler. Historians sometimes call him the king who ate himself to death, not the kind of legacy you want carved into your royal tombstone. He ruled during a time when Sweden's parliament had most of the power, so his reign was pretty quiet politically. But his final meal was anything but quiet. On February 12, 1771, the king sat down for a feast that would put any buffet to shame. First came the rich foods, lobster, caviar, and sauerkraut. Already a questionable combination, if you ask me. Then there was champagne, because, of course, there was. And finally, the pièce de résistance, a dessert called semla, which is basically a Swedish sweet roll filled with almond paste and swimming in hot milk. Sounds delicious, right? Adolf Frederick didn't just have one semla. He didn't even stop at 2 or 3. According to reports, he downed 14 of them after that mountain of seafood and sauerkraut. Now, a normal person would have slipped into a blissful food coma and maybe regretted their choices the next morning. But Adolf Frederick wasn't so lucky. After this massive feast, the king started suffering intense stomach pains. We're talking cramps, digestion gone haywire, and what must have been the mother of all bloating episodes. He died that very night, leaving Sweden without a monarch and leaving history with one of the most embarrassing royal exits ever recorded. Why is this so memorable? Well, because it's so human. Kings usually go out in battle or by assassination, or maybe from a mysterious illness that becomes the subject of conspiracy theories for centuries. Adolf Frederick, he died the way your uncle almost did last Christmas, from eating too much. His death was such a curiosity that it actually sparked a mini political crisis because his son, Gustav III, had to rush in and take the throne. Even today, Swedes remember this story with a mixture of amusement and national folklore. On Shrove Tuesday, a holiday when semlas are traditionally eaten, some jokingly call it the day of the king who ate too much. It's become part of culinary history as much as royal history. The dessert itself is still popular, and you can bet people bring up this story when they eat one. So the next time you're tempted to go for just one more slice of cake, think of King Adolf Frederick, the monarch who proved that, yes, you really can die from dessert.
Emperor Claudius. If you've ever been suspicious of mystery mushrooms on your pizza, you might be onto something, because the Emperor Claudius of Rome may have been history's most famous mushroom victim. Claudius wasn't supposed to be emperor at all. He was the awkward, bookish uncle who everyone underestimated. He had a limp, a stutter, and a tendency to hide in the library while the rest of the royal family was busy plotting and partying. When his nephew, the infamous Caligula, was assassinated, the guards found Claudius cowering behind a curtain, and instead of killing him, they dragged him out and declared him emperor. Claudius surprised everyone by actually being a pretty capable ruler. He expanded the Roman Empire, reformed laws, and generally kept things running smoothly. But ruling Rome was like sitting on a chair with a dagger underneath it. Someone was always waiting to take your place. Claudius had married 4 times, and his final wife, Agrippina the Younger, was one of the most ambitious women in Roman history. She had a son from a previous marriage, a boy you might know as Nero. Yes, that Nero, the emperor famous for supposedly fiddling while Rome burned. Agrippina wanted Nero on the throne, but there was a problem. Claudius already had his own biological son, Britannicus, who was technically next in line. Agrippina wasn't about to let her kid get passed over. Enter the mushrooms. According to Roman historians, Claudius sat down to a royal dinner one night and was served a dish of his favorite food, mushrooms. These weren't just any mushrooms. Ancient writers like Tacitus and Suetonius claim they were laced with poison. Claudius fell gravely ill almost immediately after eating them. But here's where it gets even darker and more humiliating. Some sources say Claudius didn't die right away. Agrippina reportedly called in the emperor's personal physician, who, depending on which version you believe, helped things along by shoving a poisoned feather down Claudius's throat to finish the job. Talk about a bad house call. Claudius died in 54 AD, and Agrippina wasted no time installing Nero as emperor. She even mocked the whole ordeal, allegedly calling mushrooms the food of the gods, because they had turned Claudius into one. That's cold. Claudius's death was embarrassing, not because poison was rare. Poisoning was practically a Roman hobby, but because he had been warned about Agrippina's ambition and still trusted her enough to sit down at the table. The story became a kind of cautionary tale. If you're emperor, don't eat anything your scheming spouse serves you. To this day, Claudius is remembered as the emperor who loved mushrooms a little too much. Next time you see mushrooms on your plate, maybe take a moment to wonder, are they just dinner, or are they history repeating itself?
King Alexander. There are a lot of weird ways for a king to die, but being taken out by a monkey? That's a whole new level of bizarre. And that's exactly what happened to King Alexander of Greece in 1920. Alexander wasn't even supposed to be king. He was basically the backup prince. When World War I was raging, his father, King Constantine I, was forced to abdicate because he was seen as being too friendly with Germany. So Alexander got the crown, even though he was just 23 years old and had very little political power. He was basically a puppet king, stuck between factions of politicians and foreign powers. But here's the twist. His short reign and his ridiculous death would actually change the entire future of Greece. One warm day in October 1920, Alexander was walking in the royal gardens near Athens with his pet German shepherd. Sounds peaceful enough, right? That's when things went completely sideways. Out of nowhere, a pair of monkeys that lived on the palace grounds escaped. These weren't cute little circus monkeys. These were aggressive Barbary macaques. One of the monkeys lunged at Alexander's gog, and the king, probably not wanting his beloved pet to get mauled, jumped in to break up the fight. Big mistake. While he was pulling the dog away, the second monkey attacked him, biting his leg and stomach. The bites seemed minor at first, just scratches and punctures, and Alexander reportedly brushed it off like it was no big deal. But this was 1920. Antibiotics weren't around yet. Within days, infections set in. The wound swelled, became septic, and Alexander's condition worsened fast. He developed a raging fever and agonizing pain. Doctors tried everything they could think of, which back then mostly meant cutting, draining, and praying, but nothing worked. After just a few weeks of suffering, King Alexander died. He was only 27 years old. Now here's why this wasn't just an embarrassing royal accident. It changed history. If Alexander has lived, Greece might have stayed a monarchy without interruption. But his death caused a succession crisis. His father was brought back to the throne, which angered the allies. This political mess contributed to Greece's disastrous war with Turkey, leading to the so-called Asia Minor catastrophe, a military defeat that displaced over 1 million Greeks from Turkey. Think about that. A monkey bite didn't just kill a king. It arguably changed the entire population map of the region. Winston Churchill later wrote that 250,000 people died of this monkey bite. It's one of those moments where history turns on something so random, so absurd, you almost can't believe it happened. A king with an entire army at his command was taken down, not by assassins or enemy generals, but by a monkey in his backyard. So the next time someone says, "It's just a scratch," you can tell them the story of King Alexander, the monarch whose downfall began with a monkey fight and ended with a national tragedy. George Plantagenet. You've probably heard the phrase, "pick your poison." But what if your poison was literally your favorite drink? That's exactly how George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, allegedly met his end, drowned in a barrel of wine. George was no ordinary duke. He was the brother of 2 English kings, Edward IV and Richard III, which means he was right in the middle of the bloody Wars of the Roses, the civil war between the rival houses of York and Lancaster. George's life was basically one long political soap opera. He was ambitious, restless, and famously indecisive on whose side he really was on. At first, George supported his brother Edward IV when Edward seized the throne. But then he switched sides, teaming up with the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, who had turned against Edward. Together, they actually helped overthrow Edward for a short time. But George didn't stop there. He betrayed Warwick, too, flipped back to Edward's side, and helped him regain the throne. If this sounds confusing, that's because George was kind of the ultimate opportunist, but playing political ping-pong eventually caught up to him. After being restored to favor, George couldn't resist causing more drama. He accused his brother's wife, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, of witchcraft and plotted against the royal court. Edward IV finally had enough. In 1478, George was tried for treason, by Parliament no less, and found guilty. That left Edward with a problem. How do you execute your own brother without looking like a complete monster? The solution, according to one of the most famous and bizarre stories in English history, was to give George a choice of how he wanted to die. And George, being George, supposedly picked something both dramatic and indulgent: to be drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, his favorite drink. Whether this is literally true is still debated by historians. Some think it might be a colorful myth invented later, but chroniclers at the time were convinced it happened. They wrote that George was placed head first into a huge cask of wine in the Tower of London and drowned, making him the only person in history whose death could double as a very dark pub story. It was a humiliating end for a man who spent his life scheming for power. Instead of going out as a tragic political martyr, George became the Duke remembered for drinking himself into eternity, literally. To this day, the phrase "drowned in a butt of Malmsey" lives on as one of the most memorable lines from Shakespeare's Richard III, where the event is dramatized. So George Plantagenet's last moment became part of both history and literature, forever casting him as the man who loved wine so much that it became his grave.
King Henry I. Every royal family has its quirky traditions, but King Henry I of England may have taken his a little too far, straight to the grave. His death is one of the most legendary foodie disasters in history because it supposedly happened after he ignored medical advice and overindulged in his favorite meal, lampreys. Let's set the stage. Henry I was the youngest son of William the Conqueror, the guy who famously took England in 1066. Henry was smart, calculating, and known for keeping a tight grip on power. He ruled England for 35 years, not bad in a time when kings were constantly being stabbed, poisoned, or overthrown. But Henry had one big weakness: food, specifically lampreys. If you've never heard of lampreys, picture something halfway between an eel and a leech, with a terrifying round mouth full of teeth. They were considered a delicacy in medieval Europe, and Henry loved them so much that it was almost a running joke. His doctors regularly told him to cut back, kind of like a medieval version of being told to lay off the bacon. But Henry wasn't one to take advice, even from his physicians. In December of 1135, while staying in Normandy, he sat down to a feast that included a huge serving of lampreys, way more than anyone recommended. Chroniclers at the time called it a surfeit of lampreys, meaning an excess. Basically, Henry binged hard. Almost immediately afterward, he fell violently ill. The symptoms were nasty: agonizing stomach pains, fever, and what medieval writers described as chill and convulsions. Today, historians debate whether it was food poisoning from the lampreys, a bacterial infection, or just very bad indigestion that turned into something fatal. Whatever it was, Henry didn't recover. He died shortly after, at the age of 67. This wasn't just an embarrassing way to go. It threw England into total chaos. Henry's only legitimate son had drowned years earlier, so he had named his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his heir. But many of the nobles didn't want a woman ruling England, so when Henry died, they crowned his nephew, Stephen, instead. This sparked nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchy, one of the bloodiest and most destructive periods in English history.
So yeah, a king's love for eels helped plunge an entire country into chaos. That's a lot of historical fallout from one bad meal. Even today, Henry's death is remembered as one of history's weirdest royal exits. Death by lamprey has become almost a punchline, a reminder that no matter how powerful you are, you can still be taken out by dinner. So the next time you're warned to cut back on something, maybe listen, unless you want to be remembered forever as the monarch who sparked a civil war over a plate of creepy-looking fish.
King Edward II. Few royal deaths are as infamous or as debated as the story of King Edward II's alleged murder. If you've heard this one before, you know where it's going. A red-hot poker, a very undignified location, and a lot of speculation about whether it even happened at all. Edward II was never the most popular king. He ruled England from 1307 to 1327, and his reign was marked by political chaos, military failures, and a talent for making powerful enemies. One of his biggest problems was his favorites, the close friends and advisors he showered with titles and wealth, which made the rest of the nobility furious. The most notorious of these favorites was Piers Gaveston, whose relationship with Edward sparked rumors that went beyond friendship. Whether or not those rumors were true, they were politically explosive in a medieval world obsessed with appearances. Edward's rule fell apart when England suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn against Scotland, a loss that badly damaged his reputation as a king. Eventually, even his queen, Isabella of France, turned against him. She fled to France, took a lover, Roger Mortimer, raised an army, and invaded England. Edward was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, the future Edward III, and imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. And here's where the gruesome legend comes in. According to some later chronicles, Edward's captors decided to kill him, but they didn't want to leave any visible wounds that might spark an uprising. So the story goes, they used a particularly horrific method, inserting a red-hot poker into his rectum to burn him to death from the inside. It's one of the most shocking assassination stories in history. But here's the thing. Many historians believe it never actually happened. The poker story first appeared years after Edward's death, and it may have been propaganda designed to humiliate him posthumously. Edward's enemies already accused him of weakness and unmanly behavior, so this story would have been a cruel way to mock him and reinforce those insults. Some historians think he may have been quietly strangled or smothered, a far more typical medieval execution method, and the lurid detail was added later to make the tale more scandalous. Regardless of how he actually died, Edward's end was undeniably tragic. He went from king to prisoner to murder victim, and his death marked the end of one of the most chaotic reigns in English history. The humiliation came not just from how he died, but how that death was remembered, as a punchline and a piece of dark gossip passed down through the centuries. So was it true? Probably not. But the fact that people wanted it to be true says a lot about how Edward was seen. Sometimes in history, the most humiliating thing isn't the way you die. It's the story people tell about it after you're gone.
Charles VIII. You'd think a king would go out in a blaze of glory, on the battlefield, in a dramatic assassination, maybe even a royal duel. But King Charles VIII of France, he went out by walking into a doorway. No war, no conspiracy, just bad architecture. Charles VIII, nicknamed Charles the Affable, ruled France from 1483 to 1498. He's remembered mostly for his Italian adventures, literally. He started the Italian Wars when he invaded Naples, hoping to claim it for the French crown. Spoiler, it didn't go so well. He ended up losing most of what he gained and left Italy in political chaos. But for all of his military ups and downs, what really sealed his place in history was how he died. It happened on a spring day in April 1498. Charles was at Amboise, one of those gorgeous Loire Valley castles that look like something out of a fairy tale. The occasion? A casual game of jeu de paume, basically medieval tennis. This was the elite sport of the day, and Charles loved it. After watching a match, he was leaving the court when disaster struck. The king was walking down a narrow corridor with a low stone lintel. You know, the top part of a doorway. Whether he wasn't paying attention or just moved too fast, Charles smacked his head hard against the stone. Witnesses said he staggered, tried to keep walking, then collapsed to the floor. At first, people probably thought he'd just had a nasty bump, maybe even laughed nervously. But Charles never got up. He fell into unconsciousness and died later that same day. He was only 27 years old. For a medieval king, this was a humiliating way to go. There was no glorious battle, no heroic last stand, just a fatal encounter with a doorway. Some chroniclers even commented on how tragically ordinary his death was, as if it was an insult to the very idea of kingship. It also threw France into a succession crisis. Charles had no surviving sons, so the crown passed to his distant cousin, Louis XII. That inheritance set off a whole new round of Italian wars, all because Charles didn't duck. What makes this death so memorable is how relatable it is. You don't have to be a king to understand the pain of smacking your head on something, but most of us don't die from it. Charles's death reminds us how fragile life was back then. A concussion today might send you to the ER. In 1498, it was a death sentence. And that's how the ruler of France, a man who marched armies across Europe, was brought down by the same thing that could get you if you stand up too fast in the attic. It's a reminder that no matter how powerful you are, gravity and door frames always win in the end.
King Alexander III. What's the most reckless thing you've ever done for love? Whatever it was, King Alexander III of Scotland might still have you beat, because his last act of devotion ended with him falling off a cliff. Alexander III ruled Scotland from 1249 to 1286, and for most of his life he was actually a very successful king. He strengthened the kingdom, secured Scotland's independence from Norway, and kept the country relatively stable. Not an easy feat in the Middle Ages. But Alexander was also a man with a big heart. By the time he was in his mid-40s, he had already lost his first wife and all 3 of his children. This meant that despite his accomplishments, he had no direct heir. In 1285, Alexander remarried. His new bride was Yolande of Dreux, young, beautiful, and full of life. The marriage was meant to secure the royal line with new children, but it also seems to have been a genuine love match. Alexander was smitten. Fast forward to March 1286. Alexander was at Edinburgh Castle, but Yolande was staying in Kinghorn, across the Firth of Forth. On the night of March 19th, Alexander decided he couldn't wait to see her. Despite terrible weather, heavy rain, high winds, and pitch-black darkness, he set out on horseback with just a few attendants. It was a dangerous ride from the start. The roads were muddy, visibility was awful, and medieval Scotland wasn't exactly equipped with streetlights. The king pushed forward anyway, reportedly telling his men he had to reach his queen that night. Somewhere along the way, Alexander got separated from his companions. When they caught up, they found his horse wandering riderless. Not far away, they discovered the king's body. Alexander apparently fell from his horse near the cliffs at Kinghorn. Some accounts say the horse stumbled. Others think the king simply missed the path in the darkness. Either way, he was thrown and killed instantly, breaking his neck. His sudden death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a national crisis. Alexander had no surviving children, and Yolande was pregnant but hadn't yet given birth. When her child was later stillborn, Scotland was left without a clear heir. This triggered a succession crisis that eventually invited Edward I of England to meddle in Scottish affairs, leading directly to the Wars of Scottish Independence. Yes, the same wars that gave us William Wallace and Braveheart. So Alexander's midnight dash for romance didn't just cost him his life. It changed Scottish history. His death is remembered as one of the great what-ifs of Scotland's past. If he had waited until morning, maybe there'd have been no need for Wallace, no long wars, no bloodshed. Instead, Alexander's story stands as a medieval cautionary tale. Sometimes love can't wait, but maybe it should if the road is muddy, the night is stormy, and the cliffs are close by.
King Edmund Ironside. Of all the places you'd want to meet your end as a king, the toilet is probably last on the list. But according to some accounts, that's exactly where King Edmund Ironside of England was assassinated, making his death one of the most humiliating in royal history. Edmund earned his nickname Ironside for a reason. He was one of the toughest warrior kings England ever had. During his short reign in 1016, he fought 6 brutal battles against the invading Danish army led by Canute the Great. Yes, that Canute, the one who later became King of England. Edmund was young, strong, and famously brave. Chroniclers describe him fighting side by side with his men, never backing down, even when outnumbered. But despite all that battlefield glory, Edmund's reign lasted barely 7 months. He eventually struck a deal with Canute to divide the kingdom. Edmund would keep Wessex, and Canute would rule the north. It was an uneasy peace, but at least it stopped the bloodshed. For a while. Then, just weeks later, Edmund was dead. And that's where the mystery and the embarrassment begins. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply says he died on November 30th, 1016.
But later writers weren't satisfied with such a bland ending. According to some medieval sources, Edmund was actually murdered, and not in a way that preserved his dignity. The most infamous version of the story claims Edmund was using the royal latrine when an assassin, supposedly bribed by Canute or one of his allies, hid in the cesspit beneath. As the king sat down, the killer struck upward with a dagger or spear, mortally wounding him in, well, the most vulnerable spot possible. This version became so popular that it stuck, despite having zero contemporary evidence. Chroniclers loved it because it was shocking, gory, and humiliating, a dramatic end for a king nicknamed Ironside. After all, what could be more ironic than a man famed for his strength and courage being killed while doing something so mundane? Historians today aren't sure if the toilet assassination actually happened. It might have just been propaganda invented to make Canute's takeover seem more sinister, or to mock Edmund after death. It's also possible Edmund simply died of wounds or illness after months of nonstop warfare. But the toilet story is the one everyone remembers because, let's be honest, it's unforgettable. Edmund was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, and Canute took full control of England soon after, becoming king of a North Sea empire. Edmund's embarrassing, alleged death became part of the lore surrounding the Danish conquest, turning him into a tragic figure remembered as much for how he died as for how fiercely he fought. So, was the toilet stabbing real, or just a medieval tabloid headline? We may never know. But it's a reminder that even a king nicknamed Ironside wasn't immune to meeting an undignified end, proving that history can be cruel and sometimes has a very dark sense of humor.
King William II. If history has taught us anything, it's this. Medieval hunting trips were dangerous. But in the case of King William II of England, better known as William Rufus, a single arrow may have changed the course of English history. William Rufus got his nickname from his ruddy complexion and maybe his temper, too. He was the son of William the Conqueror, and he inherited the English throne in 1087. His reign was messy, full of church disputes, rebellions, and heavy taxes that made him deeply unpopular with the clergy and plenty of nobles. He was brash, quick-tempered, and not exactly known for piety. Chroniclers at the time painted him as irreverent, even blasphemous, which, in the Middle Ages, was practically a PR nightmare. On August 2, 1100, William went out hunting in the New Forest with a group of knights and nobles. It was supposed to be a normal royal pastime, but sometime during the hunt, an arrow flew through the air, struck the king in the chest, and killed him almost instantly. The man holding the bow was Walter Tyrrell, one of William's companions. Here's where things get strange. Instead of rushing to help the king or carry his body back with dignity, most of the hunting party scattered. Walter Tyrrell fled to France almost immediately, and no one tried very hard to stop him. The king's body was eventually found and taken back to Winchester in a cart by a peasant, like just another casualty of the forest. So was it an accident or something more sinister? Officially, it was called a hunting accident. Accidents like this did happen. Hunting was dangerous, and stray arrows could easily kill. But many people, both then and now, have found the circumstances suspicious. William's younger brother, Henry, wasted no time racing to Winchester to secure the royal treasury and have himself crowned king. That speed made people wonder, did Henry know something was coming? To add fuel to the fire, William Rufus had made plenty of enemies. He was locked in a power struggle with the church, particularly Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Some chroniclers, writing years later, even suggested the whole thing was divine punishment, as if God himself had guided the arrow to rid England of a bad king. Historians still debate whether William's death was a freak accident or a quiet coup disguised as bad luck. What we do know is that it changed the line of succession dramatically. If William had lived longer, Henry might never have become king, and the future of England could have looked very different. So next time you hear the phrase hunting accident, think twice. For William Rufus, it might have been the perfect crime, one that left us with more questions than answers, and a king remembered not for his life, but for the mysterious arrow that ended it.
Tsar Alexis. We've all heard the phrase, "I laughed so hard I couldn't breathe." For Tsar Alexis of Russia, that wasn't just an exaggeration. That was how he actually died. Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich ruled Russia in the 1600s from 1645 to 1676. He wasn't a warrior czar like some of his descendants, but he was hugely important for shaping Russia into a more centralized, powerful state. He introduced legal reforms, built up the military, and oversaw the rise of Moscow as a true capital city. But for all his political achievements, his death is remembered for being oddly comedic. One night, Alexis was at a grand feast, the kind of event where the Tsar and his boyars, nobles, would sit for hours eating, drinking, and enjoying entertainment. Court jesters were common at these events, and their job was simple: make the Tsar laugh. Apparently, on this particular night, one of the jokes must have been an absolute killer, literally. Accounts from the time say that Alexis burst into such uncontrollable laughter that he started choking. Now, this wasn't just a polite royal chuckle. Witnesses described it as a full, body-shaking fit of laughter. He couldn't catch his breath, and before anyone could do anything, he collapsed at the table. His attendants rushed to help, but it was too late. The Tsar was dead, all because of a joke. Imagine being the poor court jester in that moment. One minute you're doing your job. The next minute you've accidentally murdered the most powerful man in Russia with comedy. The story goes that the court fell silent in shock, and the feast came to a screeching halt. It was one of those surreal moments where no one knew whether to laugh, cry, or panic. What makes this even more remarkable is that Alexis wasn't a fragile old man. He was in his late 40s, relatively healthy, and had ruled for over 30 years. He'd survived rebellions, political intrigue, and the harsh Russian winters, only to be taken out by a well-timed punchline. His death sent Russia into a period of instability. His son Fyodor III succeeded him, but was young and sickly, which led to power struggles among the nobility and the church. Eventually, this would pave the way for one of Russia's most famous rulers, Peter the Great, Alexis's younger son, who completely transformed the country into a European-style empire. So, in a weird way, Alexis's death by laughter set the stage for Russia's next great leap forward. It's a reminder that even the most serious, powerful leaders are still human, and sometimes fate has a dark sense of humor. The next time you have one of those uncontrollable laughing fits with friends, spare a thought for Tsar Alexis, The man who proved that dying of laughter isn't just a figure of speech.
King Henry of Navarre. Poison has always been the murder weapon of choice for people who want to keep their hands clean, which is why King Henry of Navarre's death is one of the most chilling royal mysteries. According to legend, it wasn't food, wine, or medicine that killed him. It was his gloves. Now, to be clear, this is not the Henry of Navarre who later became Henry IV. This Henry was an earlier ruler, known as Henry IV of Castile by some, Henry the Impotent by others, not exactly the nickname you want history to give you. He was King of Navarre in the late 1400s, and his reign was full of drama. Political rivalries, questions about his heirs, and constant tension with neighboring powers. By 1470, Henry had made plenty of enemies. Navarre was a small but strategically important kingdom sandwiched between France and Spain, and every decision Henry made seemed to upset somebody. So when he suddenly fell gravely ill and died, rumors spread almost instantly. The most famous theory? Someone had poisoned his gloves. Yes, gloves. In the 15th century, perfumed gloves were a luxury item for nobles. They were soaked in scented oils and worn not just as clothing, but as a kind of status symbol. According to contemporary gossip, Henry's gloves had been treated with a slow-acting poison that seeped through his skin as he wore them. It's a deliciously dramatic image. The king sitting on his throne, looking perfectly healthy, while the very fashion accessory on his hands was silently killing him. People whispered that the poison was so subtle that it looked like a natural illness. Henry wasted away, his health declining day by day until he finally died. Was it true? Historians are divided. Some think Henry may have simply succumbed to disease, since medicine at the time was, let's say, not reliable. Others point out that glove poisoning was a known assassination method in Renaissance Europe. Catherine de' Medici was later rumored to have used poisoned gloves against her enemies in France, so it wasn't impossible. Whether or not the gloves were really the culprit, Henry's death was seen as suspicious enough to become a political flashpoint. His passing led to a fight over who would inherit the throne, which in turn dragged Navarre into bigger conflicts involving France, Castile, and Aragon. In other words, his mysterious death became a catalyst for even more royal drama. Today, Henry's glove poisoning story is remembered as one of history's great royal mysteries, the perfect blend of fashion, intrigue, and tragedy. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder how many other natural royal deaths were actually a lot less natural than they looked. So the next time you slip on a pair of fancy leather gloves, just be glad they're not soaked in a 15th century slow poison.
Pope Adrian IV. When you think of a pope's death, you probably imagine something solemn, an aging pontiff passing away peacefully after years of service. Pope Adrian IV? Not quite. According to legend, he went out in a way so absurd, it still makes history buffs shake their heads. He supposedly choked on a fly that landed in his wine. Adrian IV was a pretty remarkable figure even before his strange end.
Born Nicholas Breakspear in England, he remains the only Englishman ever to become pope. He rose through the ranks of the church thanks to his intelligence and ambition, eventually being elected pope in 1154. His time as pontiff wasn't exactly quiet. He got into a power struggle with the Roman Senate, excommunicated Arnold of Brescia, a radical reformer who challenged papal authority, and even clashed with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Basically, he was a busy guy. But despite all the political drama, his death is what most people remember. In 1159, Adrian was enjoying a meal, likely one of those grand papal banquets where wine flowed freely, when fate struck. A fly landed in his wine cup. Whether he didn't see it or just didn't care, he drank anyway. And that's when things took a turn. According to chroniclers, Adrian suddenly began choking. The fly had gone down the wrong way, and despite efforts to help him, the Pope suffocated. Just like that, the most powerful religious leader in Europe was dead. Not from assassination, not from illness, but from an unlucky insect. Now, was it really a fly? Some historians have suggested that Adrian may have been suffering from tonsillitis or quinsy, a throat infection, which could have made swallowing difficult. In that case, the fly story might have just been colorful medieval gossip, a way of turning a natural death into a cautionary tale about greed, gluttony, or divine irony. But the fly version stuck, probably because it's such a striking image. The Pope felled not by emperors or rebels, but by a bug. The embarrassment factor was huge. Papal deaths were supposed to be sacred moments, with elaborate rituals following the pontiff's passing. Instead, this one sounded like a grim slapstick accident. You can almost picture the stunned silence around the table as the most important man in Christendom keeled over from what amounted to bad luck. Adrian's death also set off a papal election that became one of the messiest of the 12th century, leading to a schism and rival claimants to the papacy. So that one fly ended up changing church politics for years to come. It's a story that stuck around for centuries because it feels so oddly human. No matter how powerful you are, pope, king, or emperor, sometimes life, or in this case, a fly, just takes you out in the most ridiculous way possible. King Charles II of Navarre. If you thought royal deaths couldn't get any stranger, wait until you hear about King Charles II of Navarre, better known as Charles the Bad. His nickname wasn't an exaggeration. He was notorious for scheming, switching alliances, and generally making life miserable for everyone around him. But his death? His death was so spectacularly humiliating that it almost feels like poetic justice. Charles ruled Navarre and had claims to the French throne during the 14th century. He spent most of his life plotting against France's kings, playing both sides in the 100 Years' War, and switching loyalties whenever it benefited him. Basically, he was the guy no one could trust, a classic medieval troublemaker. By the time he reached old age, though, he wasn't the powerful schemer he once was. His health was failing, and he was in constant pain. That's when medieval medicine stepped in and made everything much, much worse. Doctors of the day decided that the best way to treat the ailing king was to wrap him in bandages soaked in brandy. Why? because brandy was considered a warming treatment, and people believed that stimulating the king's body heat might restore his strength. It sounds bizarre today, but this was cutting-edge therapy for the 14th century. Once Charles was tightly wrapped, the bandages were sewn closed with thread so they wouldn't loose end. And here's where the tragedy becomes farce. One of the attendants, supposedly trying to cut the thread with a candle nearby, accidentally set the brandy-soaked wrappings on fire. Within seconds, the king was engulfed in flames. The scene must have been horrific. Imagine a room full of attendants scrambling, screaming, trying to smother the fire. But there was little they could do. The highly flammable bandages turned the king into a human torch. Charles suffered terrible burns and died soon after. The story spread quickly, and people couldn't help but see it as darkly fitting. Charles had been nicknamed the Bad for a reason. He'd poisoned rivals, betrayed allies, and left a trail of blood and broken treaties behind him. His fiery death was almost seen as divine punishment, as though heaven itself had passed judgment. Whether every detail of the story is true is debated. Some chroniclers might have embellished it to make Charles' end sound more like a morality tale. But even if parts of the account were exaggerated, the basic fact remains. The king died from a combination of medical treatment and fire, a uniquely humiliating way for a monarch to go. Today, Charles II is remembered less for his scheming and more for this bizarre final moment, the king who literally burned because of his own treatment. It's one of those deaths that's so dramatic you couldn't make it up. So next time someone says medieval medicine was dangerous, you can point to Charles the Bat, the man whose cure was far deadlier than his disease. Bela I of Hungary. We all know that moment when a chair wobbles and you nearly fall. It's funny when it happens at home, but for King Bela I of Hungary, it was no laughing matter. His chair didn't just wobble, it collapsed under him during court, and the fall was so bad it killed him. Bela I was an 11th century Hungarian king with a reputation as a warrior and reformer. He wasn't born a king, though. In fact, his early life was rough. He spent time in exile in Poland and only returned to Hungary after a power struggle with his brother, King Andrew I. When Bela eventually took the throne in 1060, he set about consolidating power, strengthening Christianity in Hungary, and reorganizing the kingdom. Basically, he was trying to turn Hungary into a proper European-style monarchy. But Bela's reign was short, just 3 years, and it ended in one of the strangest ways imaginable. In 1063, while holding court in the town of Domos, Bela was sitting on his throne, a big ceremonial chair meant to show off his status and authority. In front of him were his nobles, attendants, and court officials. And then, in front of everyone, the throne gave way. Accounts say that the chair literally broke beneath him, sending the king crashing to the ground. This wasn't a minor tumble. The fall left him severely injured. Some chroniclers say he struck his head or spine on the stone floor, leaving him unable to walk. The injuries were so bad that Bela lingered only a few days before dying. For a medieval king, this was a deeply embarrassing way to go. Kings were supposed to die heroically in battle, or at least from some noble illness, not from a glorified workplace accident. For the nobles watching, it must have been a surreal moment. One minute they were attending a royal audience, the next minute their king was lying on the ground, his crown probably rolling across the floor. Vela's death had major political consequences. His sudden passing triggered a power vacuum at the worst possible time. His sons were young, and while they tried to hold on to the throne, supporters of the previous king, Bela's brother Andrew, called on the Holy Roman Empire for help. German forces invaded Hungary shortly after Bela's death, sparking a succession crisis that destabilized the kingdom for years. So this wasn't just a freak accident, it reshaped Hungarian politics. And the image of a king being literally dethroned by a broken chair became a kind of tragic metaphor for the fragility of power. It's a story that sticks because it's so simple and so human. Bela I wasn't defeated by an army or a rival. He was defeated by furniture. It's a reminder that sometimes history turns not on epic battles, but on the weakest leg of a chair.
King James II. When you think of medieval kings dying in battle, you probably picture a dramatic sword fight, maybe your heroic last stand. King James II of Scotland, he went out with a bang, literally. His death is one of the most explosive in history, and not in a metaphorical way. James II became King of Scotland as a child in 1437 after his father was assassinated. His early reign was full of regents, rebellions, and political drama, but by the time he was in his 20s, James had grown into a strong, confident ruler. He was determined to strengthen Scotland's independence and take back key castles still held by the English. In 1460, he launched a siege against the Roxburgh Castle, a strategically important stronghold on the border. This wasn't just a routine military campaign, this was personal. James was known for being hands-on, sometimes literally in the thick of the fight, and he wanted to see the English expelled once and for all. Now, this was the age when cannons were becoming the hot new thing in European warfare. Gunpowder weapons were still fairly new and dangerous, but kings loved them because they could smash through castle walls much faster than traditional siege engines. James, excited about his fancy artillery, decided to watch one of the big guns in action up close. Big mistake. According to chroniclers, as one of the cannons was being fired, it suddenly exploded. Whether it was poorly made, overloaded with gunpowder, or just badly aimed, no one is quite sure. But the blast sent shrapnel flying everywhere. James was standing so close that a piece of the cannon struck him and killed him instantly. Imagine the scene. One moment the king is cheering on the bombardment, the next moment he's lying dead on the field. The Scottish army was stunned. Losing a king in the middle of a battle could have thrown them into total chaos, but James's commanders held their ground. They kept the siege going and actually captured Roxburgh Castle soon after. A bittersweet victory, since the man who had ordered the attack didn't live to see it fall. James II's death became legendary, partly because of how rare it was. Plenty of kings have died in battle, but very few have been killed by their own weapon exploding in their face. It was an embarrassing way to go, made worse by the fact that James was a young man in his prime, full of ambition, and his death left a child, James III, to inherit the throne. So yes, Scotland got its castle back, but at the cost of its king. a fiery reminder that early gunpowder weapons were as dangerous to the people using them as to their enemies. If there's a lesson here, it's this. If you're a king in the 15th century, maybe stand a little farther back when the cannons go off.
Emperor Jovian. Some rulers go down in battle. Some are assassinated in the palace. And some, like Emperor Jovian of Rome, just go to bed and never wake up, leaving everyone wondering what really happened. Jovian wasn't supposed to be emperor for long. In fact, he wasn't supposed to be emperor at all. He was a career soldier, a loyal officer in the Roman army, who suddenly found himself chosen as emperor in 363 AD, after his predecessor, Julian the Apostate, was killed during a campaign against the Persians. Imagine that! One day you're just a general doing your job, the next day you're running the Roman Empire. Jovian's main job was to get the Roman army out of danger. Julian had been deep in Persian territory when he died, so Jovian negotiated a peace treaty that allowed Rome to retreat safely, though it meant giving up some territory. It wasn't a glorious start to his reign, but at least it saved the army from disaster. Unfortunately, Jovian didn't get much time to prove himself as emperor. After just 8 months on the throne, he died in a way that was both mysterious and humiliating. According to several ancient sources, Jovian was traveling back to Constantinople when he stopped for the night in a small town in Asia Minor. A tent was set up for him to sleep in, but this tent was apparently heated with a charcoal brazier. You can probably guess what happened next. The brazier filled the tent with carbon monoxide, and because the tent was sealed tightly, the emperor breathed in the fumes all night. By morning, Jovian was dead, apparently from accidental suffocation. At least that's the official story. But as with many imperial deaths, there were whispers of foul play. Some historians at the time suggested that Jovian might have been poisoned, with the fume accident being a convenient cover story. After all, Rome was a place where emperors were overthrown, assassinated, or quietly removed all the time. Jovian wasn't unpopular, but he had made some political compromises that angered certain factions, and he wasn't yet secure in power. Whether it was an accident or an assassination, the result was the same. Rome suddenly found itself without an emperor again. Jovian was only about 33 years old and ruled less than a year, making him one of the shortest reigning Roman emperors ever. His death threw the empire into yet another succession crisis, forcing the generals to scramble to elect a new leader. Jovian's story is one of those strange historical moments where we'll never really know the truth. Was he just unlucky enough to die from carbon monoxide poisoning, or was there a plot to take him out? Either way, it's a surprisingly quiet and undignified end for the man who saved the Roman army from disaster. So the next time someone tells you camping is relaxing, remember Emperor Jovian, the emperor who went to sleep as a ruler and never woke up.
King Wenceslaus III. Medieval kings were supposed to die in glorious fashion, on the battlefield, leading their men, sword in hand. King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia? He didn't even make it out of bed. Wenceslaus III was the last king of the Przemyslid dynasty, which had ruled Bohemia, today part of the Czech Republic, for over 400 years. He came to the throne as a teenager, and he inherited more than just a crown. He inherited a political mess. There were rival claims to his lands, rebellious nobles to deal with, and constant pressure from neighboring powers. In 1306, Wenceslaus was preparing to launch a military campaign to secure the Polish throne, which he had a claim to. It was a big deal. He had been crowned King of Poland earlier, but his position was shaky, and he needed to prove himself by force. The plan was to gather troops and march into battle. It should have been Wenceslaus's moment to shine, to step out of the shadow of his ancestors and show that he was a strong king. But history had other plans. In August of that year, while staying in the city of Olomouc in Moravia, Wenceslaus went to bed and never woke up. An assassin, whose identity remains a mystery to this day, slipped into his chambers and stabbed him to death as he slept. Some sources say it was a single fatal wound, others that he was stabbed multiple times. Either way, he didn't have a chance to defend himself. The murder shocked Bohemia. A king being killed was one thing. Kings were always in danger. But being murdered in bed was seen as shameful, almost cowardly. This was a time when dying in battle was considered the ultimate mark of honor. To be killed lying down, unarmed, was humiliating. Chroniclers wrote about it with a tone of pity and even disgust, as though Wenceslaus had been robbed not just of his life, but of the chance to prove his manhood on the battlefield. His death had enormous consequences. Wenceslaus had no heirs, and with him, the Przemyslid dynasty came to an end. His murder threw Bohemia into a succession crisis, with rival claimants scrambling to take control. Eventually, the crown went to the House of Luxembourg, a shift that changed the political map of Central Europe for generations. To this day, historians still debate who killed Wenceslaus and why. Was it a hired assassin sent by Polish rivals, a disgruntled noble angry at the king's policies, or just bad luck, a random act of violence? We may never know. But what we do know is that Wenceslaus III is remembered as the king who never got his last battle. Instead of dying as a warrior king, he became a cautionary tale about the dangers of royal vulnerability, proof that in the Middle Ages, not even your own bed was safe.
King Charles VIII of Sweden. If history had tabloids, the death of King Charles VIII of Sweden would have been front-page news. He wasn't killed in battle or brought down by a rival. He was found dead in bed, naked, and the gossip mill immediately went into overdrive. Charles VIII, also known as Charles Knutsson Bonde, was one of Sweden's most politically slippery kings. He came to the throne not once, not twice, but 3 separate times during the 15th century. The crown kept getting taken away from him and then handed back, thanks to constant power struggles between Sweden, Denmark, and Norway during the era of the Kalmar Union. Charles was a survivor, ambitious, cunning, and not afraid to fight for his throne. But even kings get old. By the time Charles reached his 60s, he was dealing with rebellion at home and pressure from Denmark abroad. And yet, if you believe the rumors, he still liked to have a good time. Chroniclers wrote that Charles enjoyed feasting, drinking, and the company of women, a reputation that set the stage for one of the juiciest royal death stories of the Middle Ages. In May 1470, Charles was found dead in his bed at Stockholm Castle. That alone wouldn't have been too shocking. Kings died in their sleep all the time. But there were two details that made this story explode. First, he was naked, and second, word spread that he had spent the night in some very enthusiastic company before he died. Was it true? No one knows for sure. Officially, he probably just died of natural causes, a heart attack or stroke. But medieval gossip mongers loved a scandal, and they quickly turned Charles's quiet death into a racy tale. The rumor was that the old king had literally overdone it, dying after a night of drinking and pleasure. For a 15th century monarch, this was a humiliating way to go. Dying in battle was glorious. Dying at a banquet was at least dramatic. Dying in bed after a night of fun made Charles look like a man who had let indulgence get the better of him. Not exactly the legacy he would have wanted after years of fighting for his throne. His death also marked the end of an era. Charles left no surviving sons, which meant the crown passed to his grandson, Sten Sture the Elder, who became regent of Sweden. That eventually paved the way for Sweden to break away from Danish control and become more independent. But Charles never got to see that future. In the end, Charles VIII's story reminds us that history isn't always about glorious last stands. Sometimes it's about a king who fought for his throne 3 times, only to check out of life in the most ordinary and most gossip-worthy way possible.
King Ethelred the Unready. If your nickname in history is the Unready, you're already starting with a PR problem. And poor King Ethelred didn't exactly get a heroic send-off to change anyone's mind. He died not on the battlefield, but sick and in hiding, which to medieval chroniclers was about as embarrassing as it gets. Ethelred ruled England from 978 to 1016, and his reign was, well, let's just say complicated. He came to the throne as a boy after his half-brother, King Edward the Marcher, was murdered, something that haunted Ethelred's reputation from the start. His nickname, Unready, wasn't about being lazy. It came from the Old English word unread, meaning poorly advised. And to be fair, he was surrounded by some pretty questionable advisers, which led to some disastrous decisions. The biggest crisis of his reign was the Viking threat. Danish raiders were constantly attacking England, burning towns, looting monasteries, and demanding huge payments of Danegeld, basically protection money. Instead of defeating them militarily, Ethelred often tried to pay them off, which made him look weak and bankrupted the treasury. Things got even worse when he ordered the infamous St. Brice Days massacre in 1002, an attempt to wipe out Danish settlers in England. Instead of scaring off the Vikings, it enraged them and triggered even more brutal invasions. By 1013, Ethelred's situation was so bad that he fled England entirely when King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark invaded. Ethelred went into exile in Normandy, while Svein ruled England. He only came back after Svein died suddenly, and even then his comeback was short-lived. Svein's son, Knut, yes, that Knut, invaded again in 1015, and by 1016, Ethelred was holed up in London while Knut's forces took over most of the country. This is where Ethelred's final humiliation came in. Instead of dying on the battlefield like a warrior king, he fell ill while in hiding. Sources describe him as sick in mind and body, which might mean he was suffering from both physical disease and crushing despair. He died in April 1016, leaving England in chaos and passing the throne to his son, Edmund Ironside, who at least went down fighting. For chroniclers, Ethelred's death symbolized his entire reign, passive, unlucky, and overshadowed by disaster. They saw it as fitting, a king who had failed to stop the Vikings dying quietly, away from the action, while his enemies were literally outside the city walls. Today, historians are a bit kinder. They argue that Ethelred was dealing with nearly impossible circumstances, and that his nickname was partly propaganda from later writers. Still, it's hard to shake the image of a king who spent his last days not leading armies, but hiding out, sick, while his kingdom was falling apart. So Ethelred's story ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. A reminder that sometimes history remembers not what you tried to do, but how badly things went when it mattered most.
Louis II of Hungary. There's nothing more humiliating for a king than being remembered not for the battles he fought, but for the way he fled one and drowned in the process. That's exactly what happened to Louis II of Hungary, whose death at the Battle of Mohács became one of the most infamous royal deaths in European history. Louis II became King of Hungary and Bohemia when he was just 10 years old after the sudden death of his father. That meant he grew up under the control of advisors and regents who made a lot of the big decisions for him. By the time he was old enough to rule on his own, his kingdoms were in serious danger. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, was expanding into Europe, and Hungary was next on their list. In 1526, Suleiman launched a massive invasion. Louis, only 20 years old at the time, gathered an army to meet the Ottomans at Mohács, but the Hungarians were badly outnumbered, roughly 25,000 men against Suleiman's force of more than 60,000. The battle was short and brutal. Within 2 hours, the Hungarian army was crushed, with thousands killed. Louis fought bravely at first, but when it became clear the battle was lost, he fled the field. That's when disaster struck. Still wearing his heavy suit of armor, he attempted to cross a flooded ditch or stream while on horseback. The horse either stumbled or became stuck in the mud, throwing Louis into the water. Weighted down by his armor, the young king couldn't get out. He sank and drowned. Just like that, the ruler of Hungary was gone. The humiliation wasn't just in the manner of his death, but in what it symbolized. To many, Louis's drowning looked like the ultimate image of defeat. A king weighted down by his own armor, literally and figuratively. Critics said he should have stayed and died fighting, going out as a warrior king instead of trying to escape. His enemies even mocked him, calling his death pathetic. But the consequences of Louis's death were far from funny. With no heirs, Hungary was thrown into chaos. The country was split between those who supported Ferdinand of Habsburg as king and those who supported John Zapolya. Meanwhile, the Ottomans swept in and occupied a huge portion of Hungary, beginning 150 years of foreign domination. In other words, Louis's death didn't just end his life.
It ended Hungary's independence as it had existed for centuries. Today, Louis is remembered as a tragic figure rather than just a coward. He was young, inexperienced, and faced with impossible odds. Still, his drowning became one of those unforgettable moments in history, a literal sinking of a king and a kingdom in one moment. So next time you think about the phrase going down with the ship, think of Louis II, the king who went down with his armor, and with it, the fate of an entire nation.
Emperor Valerian. Being a Roman emperor came with risks, assassinations, poisonings, betrayals. But Emperor Valerian's fate might be the most humiliating in the entire history of the empire. He's remembered as the only Roman emperor to be captured alive by a foreign enemy, and what happened to him after capture was pure nightmare fuel. Valerian became emperor in 253 AD, right in the middle of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when Rome was being attacked from all sides, suffering plagues, economic collapse, and constant civil wars. It wasn't exactly the ideal time to take the throne. One of Rome's biggest threats came from the east, the Sasanian Persians, led by their powerful king, Shapur I. In 260 AD, Valerian led a campaign against Shapur to try to stop Persian advances into Roman territory. At first, things went well. Valerian pushed back Persian forces, but then disaster struck. His army was weakened by plague, morale collapsed, and during a key battle near Edessa, Valerian was defeated and captured. And here's where things go from bad to downright degrading. Instead of ransoming Valerian back, as was often the custom, Shapur decided to turn him into a living symbol of Roman humiliation. Ancient sources claim that Shapur kept Valerian as his prisoner for the rest of his life and used him as a human footstool. Yes, you heard that right. Whenever Shapur mounted his horse, he allegedly made Valerian kneel so he could step on the emperor's back. If that sounds almost too humiliating to be true, that's because it might have been exaggerated by later Roman writers. But it fit the narrative of total Roman defeat, and it became the story everyone repeated. According to some sources, when Valerian eventually died in captivity, Shapur had his skin flayed, dyed red, and stuffed, then displayed it as a trophy in a Persian temple. Whether or not every detail is accurate, there's no doubt that Valerian never returned to Rome, and his capture was a massive blow to Roman pride. The propaganda value for Persia was enormous. They had not only beaten Rome in battle, but humiliated its emperor in a way that would be remembered for centuries. Back in Rome, Valerian's fate was an embarrassment the empire could never quite shake off. Later emperors tried to erase the memory of the disaster by portraying Shapur as a barbaric tyrant and turning Valerian's story into a cautionary tale. Today, Valerian is remembered as the emperor who suffered one of the most humiliating ends imaginable. Not killed by conspirators in the Senate, not martyred in battle, but turned into furniture for a foreign king. It's a brutal reminder that for all Rome's power and glory, even an emperor could end up on his knees, literally, serving as a footstool for his enemy. Emperor Commodus. If you've seen Gladiator, you already know Emperor Commodus was a bit unhinged. But even Hollywood couldn't make up the way he actually died, strangled in his bath by a wrestler, bringing one of the wildest imperial reigns to a very fitting end. Commodus became Roman emperor in 180 AD, succeeding his father, the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. Where Marcus was wise, restrained, and deeply respected, Commodus was, well, the opposite. He loved luxury, adored attention, and believed he was more than just a man. He genuinely saw himself as a god, specifically a living Hercules. He would pose with lion skins, carry a club, and even renamed Rome after himself, Colonia Lucia Ennia Commodiana. Yes, he basically rebranded the entire capital city in his own honor. Commodus's favorite pastime was fighting as a gladiator. He would take to the arena, dressed as Hercules, and fight animals or other gladiators, though historians say his matches were rigged so that he always won. The Roman people were both amused and horrified. To them, gladiators were low-status entertainers, and seeing the emperor fight in the arena was like watching a head of state moonlight as a circus performer. But Commodus's antics weren't just eccentric, they were dangerous. He alienated the Senate, insulted the aristocracy, and executed anyone he suspected of plotting against him. By 192 AD, even the people closest to him were fed up. A conspiracy was formed, led by his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Laetus. They feared that Commodus was about to name himself consul again and maybe even massacre his enemies in the Senate. On New Year's Eve, they made their move. First, Marcia tried to poison Commodus's food, but when that didn't finish him off quickly enough, they sent in a man named Narcissus. Not the mythological figure, but a professional wrestler and Commodus's personal training partner. Narcissus found Commodus relaxing in his bath, likely unaware that his reign was about to end. Using nothing but brute strength, Narcissus overpowered the emperor and strangled him right there in the water. And just like that, the self-proclaimed god-king was dead. Not on the battlefield, not in the Senate, but naked in the bath, taken out by his own wrestling coach. Commodus's death was greeted with relief in Rome. The Senate quickly declared him a public enemy, erased his name from monuments, and restored the city's name back to Rome. His assassination also marked the end of the Nervam Antonine dynasty and the beginning of the chaotic year of the 5 emperors. So Commodus's final moment was as strange and theatrical as his life. The emperor who thought he was Hercules met his end not with the sword in the arena, but with a wrestler's chokehold in a steamy bathhouse.
Emperor Caracalla. If there's a hall of fame for humiliating deaths, Emperor Caracalla of Rome deserves a top spot. One of the most powerful men in the ancient world, he met his end not in a glorious battle, or even a palace conspiracy, but while relieving himself on the side of the road. Caracalla, whose real name was Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus, try saying that 3 times fast, ruled Rome from 198 to 217 AD. He was famous for 2 things, bloodshed and bureaucracy.
On the one hand, he was ruthless, even murdering his own brother Geta in front of their mother so he could rule alone. On the other hand, he made one of the most sweeping legal reforms in Roman history, the Constitutio Antoniniana, which granted Roman citizenship to nearly every free man in the empire. But Caracalla also had a temper and a suspicious streak a mile wide. He was constantly on campaign, fighting Germanic tribes, Parthians, and anyone else he saw as a threat to Rome. In 217, he was traveling through Asia Minor on his way to fight the Parthians when nature called. According to the historian Cassius Dio, Caracalla stopped along the road to relieve himself, not at a private latrine, but out in the open, in a place where soldiers and attendants could still see him. It was the perfect opportunity for a man named Justinianus Martialis, one of his own soldiers, to strike. Martialis had a personal grudge against the emperor. Caracalla had apparently denied him a promotion, and he decided this was his chance for revenge. As Caracalla squatted or stood, depending on which account you read, Martialis approached him and stabbed him to death. The emperor collapsed right there, dying in one of the most undignified positions imaginable. If that wasn't humiliating enough, Martialis was immediately cut down by Caracalla's bodyguards. But the damage was done. Rome had just lost its emperor, and not in a way that inspired fear or respect, in a way that made him the butt of jokes for generations. Caracalla's death had major consequences. With no direct heir, power passed to Macrinus, the very man who had been head of the Praetorian Guard and may have even orchestrated the assassination. This was the first time in Roman history that someone outside the imperial family became emperor, a huge shift in how the empire was run. But no matter how significant that political shift was, Caracalla is still mostly remembered for how he died. The image of a mighty Roman emperor being stabbed while taking a bathroom break is so striking that it's been retold for nearly a millennia. So yes, Caracalla built roads, reformed laws, expanded citizenship, but history remembers him as the emperor who didn't even get to finish doing his business before meeting his end.
Louis VI of France. When your nickname is literally Louis the Fat, you probably don't want your cause of death to prove it true. But that's exactly what happened to Louis VI of France, a king remembered for his courage, his appetite, and for falling off his horse while chasing a thief. Louis VI ruled from 1108 to 1337, and he wasn't actually a bad king. In fact, he was one of the first French monarchs to start turning the French crown into real power rather than just a fancy title. Before him, French kings were technically rulers of the whole country, but in reality, they controlled little more than Paris and its immediate surroundings. Louis worked hard to expand royal authority, subduing rebellious lords and asserting himself as a true king of France. But Louis had a reputation for being, well, large. Chroniclers called him stout, corpulent, even the Fat, which is the nickname history gave him forever. To his credit, Louis didn't let his size stop him from being active. He loved hunting and fighting, and often led his men personally on campaigns, a rare thing for a medieval king. That brings us to his final embarrassing moment. In the summer of 1337, near the end of his reign, Louis was already in poor health. He was around 56 years old, not bad for the Middle Ages, but suffering from obesity-related issues and likely diabetes or heart trouble. One day, a thief was caught stealing from the royal household. Instead of letting his men handle it, Louis decided to personally chase the culprit on horseback. It was a bad idea. According to chroniclers, Louis, perhaps weighed down by both armor and body mass, either fell or was thrown from his horse during the pursuit. The fall left him seriously injured, probably with broken bones or internal damage. Medieval medicine wasn't exactly equipped to handle trauma like that, and Louis's condition rapidly worsened. He lingered for a short while before finally dying, leaving the throne to his son, who became the famous Louis VII. For Louis VI, though, his death was a PR disaster. Chroniclers and later writers couldn't resist pointing out the irony. The fat king who died trying to ride down a common thief. Instead of being remembered for strengthening the monarchy, he became the butt of jokes. Quite literally, the butt of jokes. Still, Louis VI's reign was crucial in the history of France. His death might have been humiliating, but his life laid the groundwork for the rise of French power in the Middle Ages. If anything, his story is a reminder that even kings have very human moments, like the temptation to settle petty scores personally, even when their bodies aren't up for it. In the end, Louis VI wasn't brought down by war or rebellion, but by one bad ride, proving that sometimes a king's legacy can hinge on something as simple as a horse, a thief, and a fall that history never lets him forget. Henry II of Champagne. When it comes to royal deaths, falling from a window is already bad, but falling into a pile of manure? That's how Henry II of Champagne left this world, and history has never let him live it down. Henry II was a big deal in his time. He was Count of Champagne, one of the most powerful lords in France, and through a twist of medieval politics, he also became King of Jerusalem. The Crusader states were struggling in the late 12th century. The Muslim leader Saladin had retaken Jerusalem, and the Christian rulers were scrambling to hold on to what land they had left. Henry married Queen Isabella I of Jerusalem, becoming co-ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and spent much of his short reign trying to keep the kingdom from collapsing entirely. But for all his titles and power, Henry's death is what everyone remembers. In 1197, Henry was at his palace in Acre, one of the last Crusader strongholds. Accounts of what happened next vary slightly, but the story goes that he was standing at a window on the upper floor, talking to someone in the courtyard below. Some say he leaned too far out, others that the railing or stone gave way. Either way, Henry suddenly toppled out the window. Now here's where the humiliation really kicks in. He didn't just fall to the ground, he landed headfirst into a dung heap. Yes, a literal pile of manure. Medieval cities were full of them, since waste from animals and sometimes humans was just dumped wherever convenient. Henry's fall was so violent that he broke his neck, dying instantly. For a king, this was about as undignified an end as possible. Medieval chroniclers, who loved a good bit of dark humor, couldn't resist mentioning the manure detail in their accounts. It turned what might have been a tragic accident into something people gossiped about for decades. Henry's sudden death left Jerusalem without a strong ruler at a critical moment. Queen Isabella married again, for the fourth time, and the kingdom staggered on for a few more decades before falling completely. But Henry's name stuck to this bizarre, grimly comic image, a king of Jerusalem whose final moment was spent plunging into filth. It's the kind of story that's hard to forget because it feels so symbolic. The ruler of a holy kingdom ending up in the muck. Whether you see it as a tragic irony or medieval slapstick, Henry's death is one of those moments where history reminds us that power and dignity can vanish in an instant. So, next time you're near an open window, take a step back and remember Henry II of Champagne, the King of Jerusalem, whose final moment was spent plunging into filth.
Mithridates VI. If you were terrified of being poisoned, how far would you go to protect yourself? Mithridates VI of Pontus took it to a whole new level, spending his life building up immunity to toxins, only to have poison fail him at the one moment he actually wanted it to work. Mithridates was one of the most fascinating kings of the ancient world. He ruled the kingdom of Pontus, a Hellenistic state on the Black Sea, from 120 to 63 BC. This wasn't some backwater king. Mithridates was a brilliant strategist, polyglot. He supposedly spoke 22 languages, and the serious thorn in the side of the Roman Republic. He fought 3 separate wars against Rome, nearly drove them out of Asia Minor, and for a time looked like he might become a major rival to Roman power. But with all his ambition came paranoia. Poison was a common way to get rid of inconvenient rulers in the ancient world, and Mithridates was obsessed with making himself unkillable. He began experimenting with small doses of poison, taking them daily to build up immunity, a process we now call Mithridatism, named after him. Over time, he became so resistant to toxins that people joked he couldn't be killed by poison at all. Fast forward to 63 BC. After years of fighting Rome, betrayal by allies, and rebellion within his own family, Mithridates was cornered. His armies were gone, his empire crumbling, and capture by the Romans would have meant public humiliation, likely being paraded through Rome in chains. For a proud king like Mithridates, that was worse than death. So he did what he had prepared his whole life to do. He tried to kill himself with poison. And nothing happened. His body shrugged it off like it was a bad cup of wine. The one time he wanted poison to work, it failed him. Faced with the ultimate irony, he had to turn to an even more humiliating option.
He called for one of his most loyal bodyguards and ordered him to finish the job. The guard reluctantly obeyed, stabbing the king to death. And that was how one of Rome's most dangerous enemies, the man who had terrified the Republic for decades, met his end. The story is almost too perfect. The king who spent his whole life making himself immune to poison was forced to rely on someone else's sword to die. It became a legend in antiquity, both as a cautionary tale and as a kind of grim punchline. Today, Mithridates is remembered as both a genius of toxicology and a tragic figure who couldn't control the one thing he wanted to control most, the manner of his own death. So next time someone says, "You are what you eat," think of Mithridates, the king who ate so much poison he couldn't even poison himself when it counted.
Emperor Qin-er-shi. History is full of powerful rulers brought down by assassins, rebels, or invaders. But Emperor Qin-er-shi? According to ancient accounts, he may have been brought down by something far less dramatic, his own broken heart. Qin-er-shi was the second emperor of the Qin dynasty, which was the first dynasty to unify China. His father was the legendary Qin Shi Huang, the emperor who built much of the Great Wall and left behind the Terracotta Army. That meant Qin-er-shi had massive shoes to fill. When he inherited the throne in 210 BC, he was still quite young and inexperienced. Unfortunately, he didn't exactly inherit a stable empire. The Qin dynasty was only about a decade old, and its rule was strict, even harsh. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and strict laws had made the people resentful. Qin-er-shi relied heavily on court officials and eunuchs to guide him, especially the infamous Zhao Gao, a manipulative court eunuch who essentially became the power behind the throne. Zhao Gao reportedly controlled the young emperor's every move, isolating him from other advisors and feeding him lies about rebellions and conspiracies. Qin-er-shi became paranoid and withdrawn, ordering purges of anyone Zhao Gao told him was disloyal. Meanwhile, rebellions really were breaking out across the empire as peasants and disgruntled nobles rose up against Qin rule. By 207 BC, Qin-er-shi's world was collapsing. The dynasty that had seemed so unstoppable under his father was crumbling under his watch. His armies were losing battle after battle. Cities were defecting to rebel forces, and even his own court was turning against him. According to the historian Sima Qian, the emperor was so overcome with grief and fear that he essentially gave up on life. Some accounts say Qin-er-shi wept constantly, unable to sleep or eat. Others claim Zhao Gao finally decided the emperor was more trouble than he was worth and encouraged him to take his own life to avoid capture. Qin-er-shi reportedly did just that, dying by suicide, either by poison or by refusing food, his body giving out as he cried over the fall of the empire.
It was a pathetic and humiliating end for the son of the man who had once ruled all of China with an iron fist. Instead of dying in battle or going down fighting, Qin Shi became remembered as a weak and manipulated ruler, someone who let a scheming eunuch and his own emotions destroy him. His death marked the end of the Qin dynasty's brief rule. Within months, the dynasty fell entirely, paving the way for the Han dynasty to rise. Qin Shi's reign became a cautionary tale in Chinese history about weak emperors and the dangers of corrupt advisors. So while Qin Shi Huang is remembered as a conqueror and builder, his son is remembered as the emperor who died crying. A tragic figure who let the weight of the world break him before his enemies could.
Emperor Yingzong of Ming. Imagine getting dethroned, humiliated, reinstated, and then failing so badly that you just gave up. That's pretty much the story of Emperor Yingzong of the Ming Dynasty, one of history's rare cases of a ruler who may have literally died of embarrassment. Yingzong, also known as Zhu Qi-ken, became Emperor of China in 1435 when he was only 8 years old. Like many child rulers, he relied heavily on advisors, and unfortunately for him, one of them was the powerful court eunuch Wang Zhen. Wang Zhen had enormous influence over the young emperor and convinced him to take a very bold and ultimately disastrous action, personally leading a massive military campaign against the Mongols. This was supposed to be a show of strength, but it turned into one of the most humiliating defeats in Chinese history. In 1449, Yingzong marched north with an enormous army, but poor planning and Wang Zhen's arrogance left the Ming forces vulnerable. At the Battle of Tumu, the Ming army was completely crushed, and worse, Yingzong himself was captured alive by the Mongols. This was a political earthquake. An emperor of China being taken prisoner was unthinkable. Back in Beijing, court officials panicked. They couldn't have the entire dynasty held hostage by the Mongols, so they quickly placed Yingzong's younger brother on the throne as the new emperor. Suddenly, Yingzong was not just a captive, he was a former emperor. Eventually, the Mongols released him, hoping his return would destabilize China. And they were right. It sparked a weird period known as the Dual Emperor Crisis, where Yingzong lived in semi-retirement while his brother ruled. But in 1457, with the help of political allies, Yingzong staged a coup and took the throne back in an event called the Seizing of the Gate. You'd think this would be his big redemption arc, but Yingzong never really recovered his dignity. His second reign was uneasy, full of political purges and suspicion toward anyone who had supported his brother. And when the Ming armies faced the Mongols again, Yingzong's forces suffered more humiliating setbacks. By 1464, the emperor was reportedly depressed, ill, and mentally exhausted. Chroniclers say that his failures weighed so heavily on him that he effectively lost the will to live. He died that year at just 36 years old, with some historians saying his death was accelerated by the emotional toll of his repeated defeats and humiliation.
Yingzong's story is remembered less as a tale of tragedy and more as a warning that pride, poor judgment, and the inability to recover from failure can destroy even the mightiest rulers. So while he technically died of illness, history remembers him as the emperor who died of shame. A man who got a rare second chance at glory and still couldn't escape the shadow of his own worst decision.
George IV. Some kings go down in history as warriors, others as great reformers. George IV of Britain? He's remembered as a playboy king who spent too much, drank too much, and ended his life bitter, bloated, and alone, with the love of his life never officially recognized. George IV's story is basically a royal soap opera. Before he became king, he fell deeply in love with a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert. The problem? As heir to the throne, he wasn't legally allowed to marry a Catholic without Parliament's approval, and there was no way they'd give it. George married Maria anyway, in a secret ceremony in 1785, making her his wife in the eyes of the Church, but not under English law. For years, Maria was his closest companion, and by most accounts, the one person who kept him grounded. But George was famously extravagant. He spent money like it was going out of style, built lavish palaces, and threw endless parties. His personal debts grew so enormous that Parliament eventually forced him into a more respectable marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick, a union that was a disaster from day one. George and Caroline separated almost immediately and spent the rest of their lives publicly feuding. Meanwhile, his relationship with Maria suffered under the strain of political pressure, though he always claimed she was the only woman he ever truly loved. By the time George finally became king in 2020, years of hard living had taken their toll. He was overweight, addicted to laudanum, an opiate, and suffering from gout and other painful conditions. His health declined rapidly, and his last years were marked by isolation. He had alienated many politicians. His wife was dead, and even Maria Fitzherbert had distanced herself from him after years of being mistreated. When George died in 2030, at the age of 67, he was a shadow of the dashing prince he once was. Contemporary accounts describe him as bloated, suffering from fluid retention, and in constant agony. Despite being the most powerful man in Britain, his death was oddly quiet. No tearful reconciliation with Maria, no great outpouring of public grief. Even his own ministers reportedly remarked that the country might be better off without him. It was a pathetic ending for a man who had spent his life chasing pleasure and admiration. He left behind a legacy of debt, scandal, and a mixed reputation. Some admired his taste for art and architecture. He helped create the Brighton Pavilion and expanded Windsor Castle. But most remembered him as vain and self-indulgent. In the end, George IV's death felt like the final act of a tragic romance. He had loved Maria Fitzherbert enough to risk scandal for her, but died without her at his side, a lonely king surrounded by luxury,
yet missing the one thing he wanted most: acceptance and love.
Charles II of Spain. Some royal deaths are dramatic, others humiliating, and some feel almost supernatural. Charles II of Spain's death is remembered not just as the end of a king, but as the end of a dynasty, with whispers of curses and witchcraft haunting his memory. Charles II was the last Habsburg king of Spain, ruling from 1665 until 1700. He was born into one of the most inbred royal families in Europe, the result of generations of close Habsburg marriages meant to keep power in the family. Unfortunately, that family strategy came with serious genetic consequences, and Charles was living proof. From birth, Charles struggled with severe health problems. He was small, frail, and didn't speak until he was 4 years old, or walk until he was 8. His jaw was famously deformed, the so-called Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he could barely chew. Chronic illnesses plagued him throughout his life, and his physical and mental development were slow enough that some contemporaries openly called him cursed. As king, Charles's reign was marked by weakness, famine, and decline. Spain, once the mightiest empire in Europe, was losing its grip on its colonies and its power in European politics. Charles's court became obsessed with his health, because everyone knew the future of the dynasty depended on him producing an heir. He married twice, but both marriages were childless. The longer this went on, the more people whispered that something supernatural was at work. Priests and advisors claimed that Charles was the victim of sorcery, that witches had cursed him to be infertile and doomed the Habsburg line. The king himself seems to have believed it. Near the end of his life, he ordered exorcisms to try to rid himself of the supposed curse, but nothing worked. By 1700, Charles was only 38 years old, but looked decades older. He was blind, his body was failing, and he reportedly suffered seizures and hallucinations. Chroniclers say he wept constantly and even feared he was possessed by demons. When he finally died on November 1, 1700, it felt like the inevitable end to a cursed life. Charles left no children, and with him the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty died out. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict over who would inherit the throne, proving that his personal tragedy had global consequences. Today, Charles II is remembered as El Hechizado, the Bewitched King, a nickname that sums up both his pitiful health and the eerie aura that surrounded him. Whether you see his life as a cautionary tale about royal inbreeding, bad luck, or dark superstition, his death remains one of the most haunting in royal history. It wasn't just a king dying. It was the death of a dynasty, with a man who believed himself cursed taking his family's future to the grave.
Louis III of France. When a king dies, you expect some grand story, a battle, a plot, maybe a duel. Louis III of France, he died the way you might expect a clumsy teenager to get hurt, by smacking his head on a doorframe while chasing a girl. Louis III was king of West Francia, roughly modern-day France, from 879 to 882. He came to power during a rough time,
Viking raids were still a major threat, and the kingdom had been politically unstable after the death of his father, Louis the Stammerer. Despite being young, Louis actually proved himself surprisingly capable. He even won a major victory against the Vikings at the Battle of Secourt in 881. A battle so impressive that it got written about in the Ludwigslied, a kind of early medieval victory poem. But all that military glory didn't save him from what came next. According to medieval chroniclers, in 882, Louis was in the town of Saint-Denis when he saw a young woman and decided to chase her. Some say to flirt, others say she was fleeing him because she wasn't interested. Either way, Louis took off running after her. Unfortunately, he forgot about one small but critical detail. Medieval buildings weren't exactly made for tall people. As Louis sprinted through a doorway, he hit his head hard on the low lintel. The impact caused severe trauma. He either fractured his skull or suffered massive brain bleeding, because soon after the king collapsed. Within days, he was dead. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was politically disastrous. Louis had no children, so his younger brother Carloman became the sole king. Louis had been seen as a promising ruler, and his early death left West Francia weaker at a time when it desperately needed strong leadership against the Vikings. But for chroniclers, the image of a king, the same king who had defeated Viking warlords, dying because he forgot to duck, was too irresistible not to write down. The story became one of those moments in history that's so absurd you almost wonder if the scribes were having a bit of fun at the king's expense. The irony is almost painful. Louis had survived war, led men in battle, and defeated some of the most feared warriors of his age, only to be killed by a piece of wood. For a medieval king whose image was tied to strength and dignity, there could hardly be a more humiliating way to go. Today, Louis III is mostly remembered for this bizarre death. It's the kind of story that makes him oddly relatable, because who hasn't hit their head on something and felt foolish afterward? The only difference is that for Louis, it wasn't just a headache. It was the end of his life, and, some say, the end of an era of promise for West Francia.
King Charles VI. Few royal deaths are as sad and as strange as that of King Charles VI of France. He didn't die in battle or by poison, but after years of mental illness that made him a laughingstock in his own court. Charles VI came to the throne in 1380 at just 11 years old and was known early on as Charles the Well-Beloved because people had such high hopes for him. And at first he lived up to the name. When he came of age, he worked to reform the kingdom, dismiss corrupt advisors, and bring stability to France during the 100 Years' War. For a brief moment, it looked like France had the strong, just ruler it needed. Then everything changed. In 1392, while on campaign, Charles suddenly suffered what seems to have been a psychotic break. He attacked his own companions, killed several men, and had to be physically restrained. Afterward, he slipped into periods of confusion,
paranoia, and terrifying delusions. What followed was a long, heartbreaking decline that lasted the rest of his life. One of Charles's strangest delusions was the belief that he was made of glass, literally. He was convinced that if anyone touched him too roughly, he would shatter into pieces. To prevent this, he reportedly had iron rods sewn into his clothes to keep him from breaking if he fell. He refused to let people touch him and would sit very still for hours, terrified of cracking. As the years passed, Charles became known as Charles the Mad. His mental illness left him unable to govern, and France descended into chaos. The royal court became a viper's nest of scheming relatives and power-hungry dukes, and the country slid deeper into civil war. Meanwhile, England took advantage of the chaos, renewing its campaigns in the 100 Years' War and inflicting more humiliating defeats on France, including the catastrophic Battle of Agincourt. Charles's personal humiliation matched the national one. Once beloved, he became a figure of pity and ridicule. Chroniclers described him wandering the halls of his palace, filthy and unkempt, sometimes forgetting who he was. He went through periods where he refused to bathe, refused to let anyone near him, or refused to speak at all. When Charles finally died in 1422, it was almost anticlimactic. There was no great drama, just the quiet end of a king who had been a prisoner of his mind for 30 decades. His death left the crown to his son, Charles VII, but by then the English were in control of large parts of France, and many French nobles had recognized England's Henry V as their king. Charles VI is remembered today as one of the most tragic figures in royal history, a king whose body lived but whose mind betrayed him, turning him into a symbol of a kingdom just as fragile and fractured as he believed himself to be.
Alexei Romanov. Sometimes the most tragic royal stories aren't about how they died, but how they lived. Alexei Nikolaevich, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, spent his short life suffering from a condition that the imperial court treated like a state secret, a secret that may have helped bring down an empire. Alexei was born in 1904, the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne. His parents, Nicholas and Alexandra, had 4 daughters before him, and the pressure to produce a male heir was enormous. His birth was celebrated across the empire, but the joy didn't last long. Soon after his birth, the royal family discovered Alexei had hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. This meant that even the smallest injury, a bruise, a bump, a cut, could lead to internal bleeding that might be fatal. For a boy expected to grow into a strong, healthy Tsar, this was devastating news. The condition became one of the Romanov family's most closely guarded secrets. In a society that prized strength and vitality in its rulers, a weak heir was seen as a threat to the monarchy's image. Nicholas and Alexandra did everything they could to keep Alexei's illness hidden from the public, fearing it would undermine faith in the dynasty. But secrecy came at a cost. Alexei's life was one of constant danger and suffering. He endured agonizing bouts of internal bleeding that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. During one particularly bad episode in 1912, doctors feared he would die. It was during this crisis that the controversial mystic Rasputin entered the picture. Rasputin seemed to have a calming effect on Alexei's pain, and Alexandra became convinced he was divinely sent to protect her son. But Rasputin's growing influence over the royal family fueled scandal and conspiracy theories, damaging the monarchy's reputation even further. People whispered that the mad monk was controlling the Tsarina and, by extension, the government. Alexei survived into his teens, but he never fully escaped his illness. He had to be watched constantly, forbidden from many physical activities other boys enjoyed, and lived with the knowledge that any small accident could be fatal. The stress weighed heavily on the entire royal family, and Alexandra in particular became increasingly isolated and paranoid, further alienating the Romanovs from the Russian public. When the Russian Revolution came in 1917, Alexei's secret condition was no longer the most pressing problem. Survival was. But the boy who had been hidden away to protect the dynasty ultimately shared its fate. He was executed with his parents and sisters in 1918, his short life ending in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Alexei's story is remembered as one of history's great what-ifs. Had he been healthy, the Romanovs might have ruled differently, perhaps even weathered the revolution. Instead, his suffering became both a private tragedy and a symbol of a monarchy bleeding out in its final years.
Emperor Ferdinand I. Few rulers are remembered for their catchphrases, but Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria is. And his famous line was less a speech and more a royal tantrum. His famous line was less a speech and more a royal tantrum. I am the emperor, and I want dumplings. It was the perfect quote for a man mocked in his lifetime as eccentric, fragile, and, by some, mad. Ferdinand became Emperor of Austria in 1835, though he probably never should have ruled at all. He had been frail since birth, suffering from epilepsy and developmental disabilities that made him prone to seizures, mood swings, and occasional outbursts. His condition was so serious that many doubted he could handle the responsibilities of ruling a sprawling empire. And they were partly right. Ferdinand wasn't really running the show. Day-to-day power was in the hands of a council led by Prince Metternich, one of the most skilled statesmen of the 19th century. Ferdinand was more of a ceremonial figurehead, and while he wasn't cruel or tyrannical, his behavior sometimes became the stuff of palace gossip. One of the most famous stories about him comes from a dinner where Ferdinand, frustrated that the kitchen had not served what he wanted, reportedly slammed his hand down and shouted, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." The line became legendary because it summed up how out of touch people thought he was, a ruler whose biggest demand was about dinner. But Ferdinand's challenges were very real. His seizures could be violent and frightening, and his medical condition made him vulnerable to ridicule from both courtiers and foreign observers. Satirists across Europe painted him as a weak and bumbling monarch, and his reign was seen as a time of stagnation. Things got more serious in 1848 when revolutions broke out across Europe.
Crowds in Vienna demanded constitutional reforms, and Ferdinand, who was not equipped to deal with such a massive political crisis, quickly lost control of the situation. Eventually, he was persuaded to abdicate in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph I, who would go on to rule for nearly 70 years. After stepping down, Ferdinand lived a quiet life in Prague, far from the center of power. By the time he died in 1875, he was remembered less as a monarch and more as a figure of fun, a gentle, strange man whose reign was marked by dinner-table demands and medical struggles rather than great decisions or battles. Today, historians see Ferdinand more sympathetically, recognizing that he was likely unfit to rule due to factors beyond his control. But the image that stuck in the public imagination is still that of the emperor with a simple desire for dumplings, a line that has outlived almost everything else about his reign. It's a reminder that sometimes history is cruelest to those who were simply in over their heads, leaving Ferdinand I as one of the most unintentionally comic figures ever to sit on a European throne.
Emperor Domitian. If there's one thing Roman emperors feared most, it was being killed by the people closest to them. Emperor Domitian lived his whole life obsessed with plots against him, and in the end, he was right. The twist? When he finally met his end, he was stabbed to death in his own palace by the very servants he thought he could control, and mocked afterward for dying like a common criminal. Domitian was the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, ruling from 81 to 96 AD. He came after his brother, the popular Titus, of Colosseum fame, and spent much of his reign trying to prove himself as a strong, decisive leader. And in many ways he succeeded. Domitian strengthened the empire's borders, improved the economy, and was an efficient administrator. But he also had a dark side. Domitian was paranoid, some would say justifiably, given what happened, and he cracked down hard on anyone he suspected of treason. He had senators executed, confiscated property, and ruled with an iron fist. Over time, his paranoia became legendary, and he surrounded himself with spies and informers to make sure no one was plotting against him. Ironically, all this suspicion just made people hate him more. By 96 AD, a conspiracy had formed within his own household, including members of the imperial court and even his wife, Domitia Longina. On the morning of September 18th, the plotters made their move. According to ancient historians, one of Domitian's servants tricked him by telling him a list of names of people scheduled to be executed, only for Domitian to discover his own name was on it. Before he could react, the conspirators attacked him. A palace official named Stephanus, who had pretended to have an injured arm so he could smuggle in a dagger under his bandages, struck first. Domitian fought back. He was a strong man and not an easy target, but he was overpowered and stabbed multiple times. For Romans, this was the ultimate humiliation. Emperors were supposed to die on the battlefield, or at least with some kind of dignity.
Being murdered by servants in your own home was a death more suited to a hated tyrant or disgraced senator. After his assassination, the Senate was so thrilled that they declared damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of his memory. His statues were torn down, his name was erased from inscriptions, and he was mocked for dying like a slave. Today, historians see Domitian as a more complicated figure, a capable ruler whose paranoia ultimately destroyed him. But the image that stuck is of an emperor bleeding out on the palace floor, betrayed by the people he trusted most. It's a reminder that in ancient Rome, the closer you were to power, the sharper the knives became. And Domitian's death was as sharp, bloody, and humiliating as they come.
King Charles XII. King Charles XII of Sweden was the kind of ruler who seemed impossible to kill. He was a brilliant military commander, fought in dozens of battles, and survived countless close calls on the battlefield. But when death finally came for him, it came in the most dramatic way possible. A single bullet to the head, during a siege, under circumstances so mysterious that people still argue about it 300 years later. Charles XII, known as the Warrior King, ruled Sweden from 1697 to 1718, and turned his country into a military powerhouse during the Great Northern War. He personally led his armies across Europe, defeating much larger foes, including Denmark, Poland, and Russia, early in his reign. He was bold, fearless, and absolutely obsessed with war. But war takes its toll. By 1718, Sweden had been fighting for nearly 2 decades, and Charles was determined to finish the fight on his own terms. He launched a campaign against Norway, hoping to pressure Denmark-Norway into peace. In late November, he was at the siege of the fortress of Fredriksen, personally inspecting trenches near the front line. That's when it happened. On the night of November 30th, Charles was looking over the ramparts when a bullet struck him in the head, passing clean through his skull. He collapsed instantly, dead before he even hit the ground. His soldiers were stunned. Their warrior king, who had seemed untouchable, was gone in an instant. But here's where the story gets interesting. No one knows for sure who fired the fatal shot. Some said it came from the fortress, that a Norwegian defender's musket ended the king's life. Others whispered that it came from the Swedish lines, an assassin's bullet from someone who had finally had enough of Charles's endless wars. The conspiracy theory gained traction because Charles was a divisive figure even among his own people. His wars had bankrupted Sweden and cost tens of thousands of lives. Some of his officers, weary of fighting, may have seen his death as the only way to end the bloodshed. In the centuries since, historians and ballistics experts have tried to figure out the truth. They've studied the wound, the position of the body, and even recreated the scene to see which direction the shot most likely came from. The verdict? Still inconclusive. The mystery remains.
What's certain is that Charles's death ended Sweden's time as a great power. Without him, the war quickly ended, and Sweden never regained its former dominance in Europe. So Charles XII went out the only way he probably could, with a bullet on a battlefield in the middle of a war. Whether it was enemy fire or friendly fire, it was a death fit for a warrior king, but also one of the most hotly debated royal deaths in history. King Wenceslas IV. If you think royal courts were all polite dinners and fancy banquets, think again. King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia proved that even kings could get messy, literally. His death came not on the battlefield or in the throne room, but during what was essentially a drunken brawl. Wenceslas IV ruled Bohemia, part of today's Czech Republic, from 1378 to 1419, and he was also King of Germany for a while. But Wenceslas was never known as a model king. He had a reputation for being lazy, impulsive, and far more interested in hunting and drinking than in the tedious business of governing. Chroniclers said he was often found in the company of commoners, drinking in taverns and getting into fistfights, behavior that scandalized the nobility. His reign was marked by constant trouble, conflicts with the nobility, feuds with the church, and political crises that eventually helped set the stage for the Hussite Wars. He was even deposed as King of Germany at one point because the princes were fed up with him. But despite all the chaos, Wenceslas managed to hang on to the Bohemian throne, at least until his very boisterous final day. According to accounts, Wenceslas spent the day drinking heavily at his hunting lodge near Prague. He was known for throwing back more than a few tankards, and on this particular day, things apparently got out of hand. At some point, an argument broke out. Some say with servants, others say with companions, and it turned into a physical struggle. In the middle of this drunken scuffle, Wenceslas collapsed. Some chroniclers suggest he choked on his own food or drink, others that he was strangled accidentally during the fight. Either way, by the time the commotion stopped, the king was dead. For a medieval monarch, this was an embarrassingly low-brow way to go. Dying in bed of old age was one thing, dying heroically in war was another, but dying in a drunken tussle was practically the royal equivalent of being found face down in a bar. Chroniclers, who already thought little of Wenceslas, had a field day with the story, portraying that as a fitting end for a king who had squandered his crown on pleasure and drink. His death also left Bohemia politically unstable. His brother Sigismund would eventually inherit the throne, but by then the kingdom was already on the verge of religious rebellion. In a way, Wenceslas's chaotic reign and chaotic death lit the fuse for the Hussite movement that would plunge Bohemia into decades of conflict. So Wenceslas IV is remembered less for what he built, and more for how he went out, after one drink too many, during one fight too many. It's one of history's starkest reminders that sometimes kings really are just men, and sometimes they die like men who stayed too long at the tavern.
King Ananda Mahidol. Some royal deaths shake a family. some shake country. The death of King Ananda Mahidol of Thailand in 1946 shook an entire nation and left questions that still haven't been fully answered. Ananda Mahidol was never supposed to be king. Born in 1925, he was living in Switzerland with his family when his uncle, King Prajadipok, abdicated in 1935. Suddenly, the 9-year-old boy became King Rama VIII of Thailand. Because he was so young, he stayed in Europe to finish his education while a regent ruled in his name. He eventually returned to Thailand during World War II, where he was seen as a symbol of hope for a country that had been through political turmoil and Japanese occupation. By 1946, Ananda was just 20 years old and beginning to take a more active role as king. People expected him to modernize the monarchy and guide Thailand into a new era. Instead, tragedy struck. On June 9, 1946, Ananda was found dead in his bed in the Grand Palace in Bangkok. He had been shot in the head with a single bullet from his own pistol. At first, officials announced it was an accident, that the young king had been cleaning his gun when it went off. But almost immediately, suspicions arose. The circumstances didn't make sense. The position of the wound, the lack of gun-cleaning materials nearby, and the fact that Ananda had seemed cheerful the night before all led people to doubt the accidental discharge story. Suicide was also suggested, but friends and family said he hadn't shown any signs of despair. That left the most unsettling possibility: murder. Who could have killed the king, and why? The investigation turned into one of the most controversial legal cases in Thai history. 3 palace officials were arrested, accused of assassinating Ananda, and eventually executed. But many observers at the time, and many historians since, have argued that the evidence against them was flimsy. Some have suggested that political factions were using the trial to settle scores or cover up the truth. Then there's the question of succession. Ananda's younger brother, Bhumibol Adulyadej, became King Rama IX immediately after the death and went on to rule for 70 years, becoming one of Thailand's most beloved monarchs. But the shadow of Ananda's death loomed over the early years of his reign, with whispers of conspiracy never fully silenced. To this day, King Ananda's death remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of modern history. Was it an accident, suicide, or assassination? No one can say for sure. What we do know is that his death marked a turning point for Thailand, ushering in a new era, but leaving behind a tragedy that still sparks debate, and a mystery that may never be fully solved.
King Edmund II. Few kings get to choose how they're remembered, and King Edmund II, better known as Edmund Ironside, is one of the unluckiest of them all. He was a fierce warrior who fought 6 brutal battles against Viking invaders, but most people remember him for one thing: the story that he was assassinated while sitting on the toilet. Edmund became King of England in 1016, during one of the most dangerous moments in its history. The Danes, led by the famous Canute,
Yes, the one who later became King of England, Denmark, and Norway, were pressing hard to conquer the country. Edmund refused to give up without a fight. He earned the nickname Ironside for his courage and strength, and he managed to hold off the Danes long enough to strike a deal. England would be divided between them, with Edmund ruling Wessex in the south and Canute ruling the north. It was a clever compromise that kept England from falling completely, but it didn't last. Only a few weeks after the deal, Edmund was dead. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply says he died on November 30th, 1016, but later storytellers weren't content with such a quiet ending for such a larger-than-life king. And that's where the toilet story comes in. According to one version, Edmund was sitting on the royal latrine when an assassin, supposedly hiding below, stabbed him from underneath with a dagger or spear. The idea was so shocking, so humiliating, that it spread like wildfire. Imagine it, the mighty Ironside, the man who fought Canute's armies to a standstill, brought down in the most undignified way possible while relieving himself. It's hard to know if the story's true. Some historians think it was propaganda, maybe spread by Canute's supporters to make Edmund look weak in death. Others think it might have been a way to explain his sudden death when there were no battle wounds or signs of illness. Either way, the story stuck. Part of why this version became so popular is because it's unforgettable. There's something darkly comic about it. The great warrior king caught in his most private moment. It also sent a message that even the strongest man could be struck down when he least expected it. Canute went on to take full control of England after Edmund's death, becoming one of its most famous kings. But Edmund's story has lived on as one of the most humiliating royal death rumors in history, a reminder that medieval chroniclers loved a good scandal as much as any modern tabloid. So while Edmund Ironside probably deserved to be remembered as a heroic fighter, history had other plans. Today, he's the king with the toilet assassination story, proof that once a rumor is funny enough, it can outlive the truth.
King George II. When you think about royal thrones, you probably picture gold, velvet, and pomp. For King George II of Great Britain, though, the throne he died on was the other kind, the bathroom throne. His death in 1760 became one of the most memorable and embarrassing royal exits in British history. George II wasn't a bad king, but he wasn't exactly adored either. He was the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, which made him seem brave and hands-on. But he was also famously hot-tempered, short, barely over 5'5", and sometimes petty, often clashing with his ministers and even his own son. By the end of his reign, Britain was in the middle of the 7 Years' War, and George was an aging monarch who mostly let his ministers handle the big decisions. On the morning of October 25th, 1760, George woke up feeling fine, reportedly even cheerful. He drank his usual cup of hot chocolate and went about his morning routine. Then he went to use the toilet in Kensington Palace. While seated, he suddenly let out a loud cry and collapsed. Servants rushed in to find the king dead.
The cause? An aortic aneurysm, basically a fatal rupture of a major blood vessel near the heart. It killed him almost instantly. There was no long, dramatic deathbed scene, no gathered courtiers waiting for final words, just a king found lifeless on the loo. For 18th century Britain, this was both shocking and a little funny. Toilet deaths have always carried a certain taboo humor, and the idea of the King of Great Britain keeling over in such a private, undignified setting was irresistible. Satirists had a field day, and George's death became one of the earliest bathroom humor moments in royal history. Still, his death marked the end of an era. George II was succeeded by his grandson, George III, yes, the one who would go on to lose the American colonies. George II's passing also made him the last monarch buried at Westminster Abbey. Later monarchs were buried at Windsor. What makes this death so memorable is the contrast between George's life and his ending. This was a man who had faced cannon fire in battle, steered Britain through major wars, and ruled for over 30 decades, only to be remembered by many as the king who died on the toilet. It's a reminder that death doesn't care about dignity, titles, or crowns. Even kings can meet their end in a moment so ordinary that it almost feels comical. So the next time someone says the king died on the throne, you might want to ask, which one? Because in George II's case, it wasn't the one with the crown on top. Emperor Elagabalus. If there was ever a Roman emperor who seemed destined for a dramatic end, it was Elagabalus. His life was outrageous, his reign was chaotic, and his death was so humiliating that even in the blood-soaked history of Rome it stands out. Dragged naked through the streets, then thrown into the sewer. Elagabalus became emperor at just 14 years old in 218 AD, thanks to a power play by his grandmother and mother. From the start, he was different from any emperor Rome had ever seen. He was a high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, and when he became emperor, he brought his god and his wild religious practices to Rome. That might not sound too bad, but Elagabalus took things to extremes. He replaced Jupiter, Rome's chief god, with his own deity, married a Vestal virgin, a massive taboo, and reportedly hosted bizarre ceremonies that horrified the Roman elite. And that's not even getting into the rumors about his personal life. Ancient writers gleefully accused him of everything from outrageous sexual behavior to spending fortunes on parties, exotic foods, and bizarre stunts. Whether all the stories are true or just hostile gossip, the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, eventually had enough. In 222 AD, a plot was hatched to get rid of him, and his own grandmother is said to have approved it. The Praetorian Guard struck when Elagabalus was at the palace. He tried to hide, reportedly even begging for mercy, but he and his mother were captured and killed. And that's when the humiliation really started. The guard stripped his body naked, tied it to a hook, and dragged it through the streets of Rome. Ancient chroniclers note that the mob jeered as the emperor's corpse was pulled along the ground, his body battered and filthy. It was the ultimate act of public shaming, turning the emperor, who had once been the most powerful man in the empire, into an object of ridicule. Finally, his body was thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, as if he were literal garbage. To the conspirators, this was a way of purging Rome of his memory and dishonor. To everyone else, it was a grimly poetic ending for a ruler whose reign had been seen as a moral sewer. Elagabalus's death was a warning. Emperors who went too far could end up with their names dragged through the mud, literally. His memory was officially condemned, damnatio memoriae. His statues were destroyed, and for centuries he was remembered as one of the worst emperors Rome ever had. So yes, Elagabalus lived scandalously, ruled chaotically, and died in a way that made sure everyone knew Rome was done with him. Few deaths in history combine humiliation and symbolism so perfectly. A god-emperor tossed into the sewer where the city's filth flowed.
Emperor Frederick III. Royal deaths are supposed to be dignified, lying in state, courtiers gathered around, candles burning. But the death of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III was anything but elegant. His last days were a slow, painful decline, marked by botched surgery, rotting flesh, and a smell that reportedly made everyone keep their distance. Frederick III ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1452 to 1493, one of the longest reigns in medieval history. He was cautious, stubborn, and patient. So patient, in fact, that he earned the nickname Frederick the Peaceful. His motto was, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry," which perfectly captured his strategy of expanding the Habsburg power through dynastic marriages rather than constant fighting. But by the early 1490s, Frederick III was very old for the time, over 70, and his health was failing. He suffered from terrible leg pain, likely due to poor circulation or diabetes, and eventually developed severe gangrene. Gangrene, if you're lucky enough to never have encountered it, is when part of your body literally starts to die and decay. In Frederick's case, his leg was so bad that doctors decided it needed to be amputated. In 1493, he traveled to Linz to have the operation. Now, remember, this was the 15th century. Anesthesia didn't exist yet. Antiseptics weren't a thing, and surgeries were often a death sentence. The imperial court brought in the best surgeons they could find, and the operation reportedly took hours. Miraculously, Frederick survived the amputation, but only for a few months. The wound never healed properly, and infection set in. Chroniclers say the smell of rotting flesh was so strong that courtiers had to burn incense just to be in the same room with him. Frederick, who had once been one of Europe's most powerful rulers, spent his last days bedridden, in agony, and quite literally decomposing while still alive. When he finally died on August 19, 1493, it was almost a relief for everyone involved. His death marked the end of an era, but it also cleared the way for his much more famous son, Maximilian I, to take the throne and turn the Habsburg dynasty into a true European powerhouse. Still, Frederick's death left an impression, not just politically, but olfactorily. The image of the emperor's body slowly rotting while he was still breathing became a kind of cautionary tale about the limits of medicine and the inevitability of decay no matter how high your station in life. So Frederick III may have been a shrewd ruler who expanded the Habsburg legacy without endless wars, but history remembers his last chapter as grim and grotesque. The emperor who ruled Europe for decades only to end up stinking up his own court in the final months of his life.
King Philip of France. If you think dying in battle is a noble way to go, King Philip of France might make you think twice. His death didn't come in the heat of war or in a heroic charge. It happened during what was supposed to be a celebration, when his own horse trampled him to death in front of everyone. The Philip we're talking about here is King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, who ruled from 1285 to 1414. And the fair didn't mean nice, it meant handsome. He was tall, striking, and known for his cold, calculating personality. Philip was a serious king with serious ambitions. He expanded French territory, strengthened royal power, and is most famous for going head-to-head with the Pope and dissolving the Knights Templar. But even the most powerful kings can't control everything, especially their horses. In November 1314, Philip was out hunting, one of his favorite pastimes, near Fontainebleau. By this point, he was in his late 40s and had spent years consolidating his power, fighting wars, and dealing with scandals involving his family. He was probably ready for a quiet ride and a break from politics. But during the outing, something went wrong. Sources differ on the details, but most agree that Philip either fell from his horse or was thrown, and the horse then stumbled or reared and trampled him to death. Whatever happened, the injuries were severe. A king's hunting party was supposed to be a controlled, even glamorous event, but this quickly turned into chaos. Philip was carried away from the scene, badly hurt. For several weeks he lingered, unable to recover from the internal injuries. Medieval medicine had no real way to treat trauma like that. No surgery, no painkillers, no chance of repair. So the king simply wasted away until he died on November 29, 1314. For the French court, this was a humiliating way for such a commanding monarch to go. Philip had faced down popes and crushed military enemies, but in the end he was brought down by an accident, and by the very animal that had carried him to so many victories. Chroniclers at the time noted the irony. The king who had humbled the Templars, strengthened France, and terrified his enemies, died not in battle, but in a moment of bad luck on a hunting trail. His death also sparked a period of instability. His 3 sons would all become kings in turn, but none of them produced surviving male heirs, leading to a succession crisis that helped ignite the 100 Years' War between France and England. So Philip the Fair's death wasn't just dramatic, it was a turning point. The sight of a king being trampled at his own hunt became a symbol of fate's cruelty, a reminder that no amount of power or ambition can protect you from a single moment
of misstep. King Albert I. Some kings are remembered for their wars, others for their scandals. King Albert I of Belgium is remembered as a national hero, but also for dying in one of the most unexpected, almost absurd ways, falling to his death during a solo mountain climbing trip. Albert I ruled Belgium from 1909 to 1934, and he was one of the most admired monarchs of his time. When World War I broke out, he refused to let German forces march through Belgium unopposed, even though it meant putting his small country in the path of a military giant. His decision earned Belgium the sympathy of the Allies, and Albert himself fought alongside his soldiers on the front lines, earning the nickname the Night King. After the war, Albert remained a deeply respected figure, seen as a symbol of courage and national unity. Unlike many other European royals, he was known for being approachable, athletic, and down-to-earth. One of his favorite pastimes was rock climbing, something that was both unusual and risky for a head of state. On February 17, 1934, Albert went climbing near Marche-les-Dames, a rugged area of cliffs and forests along the Meuse River. He was climbing alone, something that would make modern safety experts cringe, when he apparently slipped and fell. When his body was discovered, he had died instantly from the fall. The news stunned Belgium. The heroic king, who had survived the horrors of war and international crises, was dead from what seemed like a random hobby accident. To some, it felt tragically ironic. The man who had faced down the German army had been defeated by gravity. Almost immediately, conspiracy theories began to spread. Some people simply couldn't believe that such an experienced climber would make a fatal mistake. Was it really an accident? Could he have been pushed or even assassinated? Some of these theories linger to this day, though no hard evidence has ever been found to support them. For those who accepted the official story, Albert's death was still hard to swallow. He had been a symbol of strength and stability, and now he had died in a way that felt almost mundane, the kind of thing that could happen to any weekend adventurer. Some even mocked the king for being reckless, suggesting that a man of his position should have left dangerous hobbies behind. But for many Belgians, Albert's death only added to his legend. He wasn't a distant monarch living in luxury. He was a man who loved adventure and lived life on his own terms. And if that life ended on a cliffside, at least it ended doing something he loved. So King Albert I's story is both tragic and oddly human. A king who fought for his country, inspired his people, and died not in war, but in a solitary, fateful fall that still fascinates historians and climbers alike.
Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Emperor Frederick I, better known as Frederick Barbarossa, was one of the most famous medieval rulers, a man whose name still carries the weight of legend. He was strong and cunning and larger than life.
which is why his death is almost comically out of step with his reputation. He drowned while crossing a river that wasn't even particularly deep. Barbarossa ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1155 to 1190 and spent much of his life trying to turn the empire into a truly powerful, centralized state. He was a warrior emperor, personally leading campaigns in Italy to assert his authority over rebellious cities and clashing with popes who resisted his rule. He was feared and respected and, thanks to his fiery red beard, instantly recognizable. In 1189, Barbarossa answered the call for the Third Crusade after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin. This was supposed to be his crowning moment, a grand expedition to restore Christian control of the Holy Land, with Barbarossa leading a massive German army overland to the east. For nearly a year, the crusade marched through Europe and into Asia Minor, fighting battles along the way. Barbarossa, despite being in his late 60s, insisted on riding with his troops, proving that he was still every inch the warrior king. Then, in June 1190, disaster struck. The army was crossing the Selef River, modern-day Göksu River in Turkey. The river wasn't particularly deep or fast. Some accounts say it was barely up to a man's waist, but as Barbarossa attempted to cross, he either fell from his horse or was swept away by the current. His armor weighed him down, and before anyone could save him, the great emperor drowned. Just like that, the most powerful man in Christendom was gone, not in a battle against Saladin's forces, but in what amounted to a freak accident. The effect on the crusade was catastrophic. Barbarossa's death demoralized his army. Many soldiers turned back home, and the German crusading force that reached the Holy Land was a fraction of what it had been. Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France would carry on the crusade, but without Barbarossa, its momentum was never the same. Back home, Barbarossa's death became the stuff of legend. Germans couldn't believe that such a mighty ruler had drowned so ingloriously, so they told stories that he hadn't really died, that he was merely sleeping in a mountain, waiting to return in Germany's hour of greatest need. But the truth was simpler and sadder. The great emperor, who had fought for decades, defied popes, and nearly united the empire, was undone not by war or treachery, but by a shallow river and the weight of his own armor. It's a story that reminds us that even the mightiest rulers are at the mercy of chance, and that history's most legendary figures can sometimes meet the most ordinary, almost absurd ends.
Peter III of Russia. Some royal deaths are tragic accidents. Others are assassinations. And then there are deaths like Peter III's, a mix of humiliation, betrayal, and mystery, all wrapped up in a palace coup led by his own wife. Peter III became Emperor of Russia in January 1762, succeeding his aunt, Empress Elizabeth. He had been raised in Germany and was awkward, unpopular, and more than a little eccentric. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia, so much so that when he took the throne, one of his first moves was to end Russia's war against Prussia and make peace. This infuriated the Russian nobility and army officers, who saw it as throwing away a hard-won victory. Peter didn't stop there.
He introduced reforms that alienated the Orthodox Church, offended his courtiers with his bluntness, and purportedly spent more time playing with toy soldiers than governing. Worst of all for Peter, his wife, Catherine, the future Catherine the Great, was far more charismatic and politically savvy than he was. Within just 6 months of his reign, Catherine and her allies decided they'd had enough. In July 1762, while Peter was away from the capital at his country residence, Catherine staged a coup. She rode into St. Petersburg, rallied the Guards' regiments to her side, and had herself proclaimed empress. Peter was caught completely off guard. He returned to find that the army, the church, and the court had abandoned him. Facing overwhelming odds, he agreed to abdicate, an act that left him completely humiliated. The man who had been Emperor of Russia was suddenly a prisoner, stripped of his throne by the woman who was now ruling in his place. And then things got even darker. Just a few days after his abdication, Peter died under mysterious circumstances. The official report claimed that he died of hemorrhoidal colic, basically a digestive issue, but almost no one believed that. The more widely accepted story is that he was murdered, possibly strangled, by officers loyal to Catherine. Whether Catherine personally ordered the killing is still debated. Some historians think she wanted him alive, but that her supporters took matters into their own hands. Others think Catherine, brilliant and calculating as she was, knew that leaving Peter alive would always be a threat to her throne. What's certain is that Peter's death cleared the way for Catherine to rule as one of Russia's greatest monarchs. His humiliation was complete, remembered not for his reforms or policies, but as the man who lost his throne to his wife and was quietly eliminated to make way for her reign. So Peter III's story is a mix of royal soap opera and political thriller, a man who went from emperor to prisoner to corpse in just a matter of days, all because his wife outmaneuvered him.
Charles XII's horse. Most kings are remembered with statues, monuments, or grand tombs. King Charles XII of Sweden? He's partly remembered because his horse outlived him and was stuffed and put on display. It's one of the strangest royal legacies in history, and some say it almost feels like a mockery. Charles XII, the warrior king of Sweden, was killed in 1718 during the siege of Fredriksten, likely by a bullet to the head. His death ended Sweden's era as a European great power, but it also left behind some odd relics, one of the most famous being his horse, Bruce. Bruce wasn't just any horse. He had carried Charles through countless campaigns during the Great Northern War, from Poland to Norway to the battlefields of Russia. Charles was practically inseparable from his horse, riding into danger alongside his troops and personally leading charges. Bruce was a symbol of the king's fearless, relentless style of warfare. When Charles died, Bruce survived him. And what happened next turned the horse into a piece of Swedish history. Instead of quietly retiring him to a pasture, Charles's admirers decided to preserve him as a tribute to the king. Bruce was stuffed and put on display, reportedly with a glass eye, almost as if to keep watch over Sweden's memory of its fallen monarch. At first, this might have seemed like a way to honor the king,
a way to immortalize the image of Charles as a warrior forever astride his faithful steed. But over time, the stuffed horse took on a different, almost mocking tone. Visitors would come to see it, not with solemn reverence, but with a sense of curiosity and even amusement. The horse became a kind of strange spectacle, a reminder that Charles's grand ambitions had ended with him lying dead in the mud, while his horse became a museum exhibit. Historians sometimes point out that this legacy is oddly fitting. Charles XII's life was dedicated to war, to the idea that Sweden could dominate Europe if only he fought hard enough. But in the end, all that remained of that dream was a dead king, a stuffed horse, and a country exhausted by decades of conflict. Even today, Bruce is a curiosity, a relic that draws tourists not because of its grandeur, but because of how strange and macabre it is. It almost feels like a historical punchline. Charles XII's horse got the taxidermy treatment, while Charles himself got a bullet and a coffin. So while other kings are immortalized in marble or bronze, Charles XII's legacy comes with a stuffed animal, a slightly creepy reminder of a king who lived and died for war, and whose most enduring companion ended up as part of Sweden's strangest royal memorial.
Prince Alfred. When it comes to royal scandals, few are as shocking as the death of Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's second son. He didn't die in battle or from illness. He died from a gunshot wound that, by most accounts, he gave himself. The tragedy was kept as quiet as possible at the time, but it became one of the most whispered about royal stories of the 19th century. Prince Alfred was born in 1844 and grew up as part of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's famously large royal brood. He had a solid career in the Royal Navy, traveling widely and earning a reputation as a competent officer. Later, he became Duke of Edinburgh and, through marriage, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in Germany. But Alfred's life wasn't as happy as it looked from the outside. He reportedly struggled with health issues and bouts of depression, and his marriage to Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia was famously unhappy. The couple clashed over culture, religion, and court etiquette, and gossip swirled that their home life was a miserable one. In early 1900, Alfred was living in Coburg when tragedy struck. According to reports, he suffered a self-inflicted gunshot wound, an event so shocking that newspapers at the time barely reported the details. Some said it was a hunting accident, others that he had been cleaning his weapon, but many historians now believe it was a suicide attempt. Alfred survived the initial injury, but was gravely wounded. He lingered for several days, his condition kept secret from the public as doctors tried to save him. The news finally broke that the Duke had died on July 30th, 1900, just days after his only son's wedding. The timing added an extra layer of tragedy and scandal to the event. The British royal family, famously strict about propriety, downplayed the circumstances of Alfred's death as much as possible. Official statements focused on his illness, leaving out the details of how he had been injured. But in Germany, the story was harder to suppress, and whispers about the accidental or intentional nature of the shooting spread quickly. For the public,
The idea of a prince dying in such a way was deeply unsettling. Royalty was supposed to be strong, composed, and above the struggles of ordinary life, and Alfred's death reminded people that even princes could be broken by personal pain. Today, Prince Alfred is remembered as one of Queen Victoria's more tragic children, overshadowed by the more dramatic reigns and scandals of his siblings. His death remains a sobering glimpse into the pressures of royal duty and how those pressures sometimes ended in quiet, scandalous tragedy.
Louis XVI. If there's one royal death that changed the course of history, it's Louis XVI of France. His execution wasn't just a death, it was a public spectacle, a statement, and a humiliating end for a king who had been mocked, ridiculed, and rejected by his own people. Louis XVI became king in 1774, at just 20 years old. He was shy, awkward, and by most accounts a kind man, but not a natural leader. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was young, glamorous, and, unfairly or not, became the symbol of royal excess. The two of them inherited a France that was already in financial crisis, drowning in debt from wars, including the American Revolution, which Louis had funded. Louis tried to fix the situation with new taxes and reforms, but his efforts only angered the nobility and the common people alike. By 1789, the pressure exploded into the French Revolution. The monarchy was forced to share power with the Revolutionary National Assembly, and Louis's every move was scrutinized by a restless, angry public. Things got worse when Louis and his family tried to escape Paris in 1791. They were caught at Varennes and brought back under guard, a moment that made him look like a coward who had abandoned his people. Revolutionary newspapers mocked him mercilessly, calling him Louis the Last. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia. Royalists were plotting counter-revolutions, and Paris was in chaos. The monarchy was officially abolished, and Louis was put on trial for treason. His quiet, hesitant personality worked against him. He seemed incapable of defending himself forcefully, and the trial was essentially a foregone conclusion. On January 21, 1793, Louis was led to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. Thousands of Parisians gathered to watch. Louis tried to speak, declaring that he had always wanted the best for his people and forgiving those who condemned him. But the drums rolled to drown out his voice. Then came the blade. With a single swift motion, the king was decapitated, the ultimate humiliation for a monarch who had been taught that kings ruled by divine right. The crowd erupted in cheers, some dipping their handkerchiefs in his blood as souvenirs. Louis's death was a turning point. It sent shockwaves across Europe, terrified other monarchs, and pushed the revolution into its most radical phase. But it was also a deeply personal humiliation. The shy young king, who had never wanted the throne, had been stripped of his crown, his dignity, and finally his head in front of his former subjects. Today, Louis XVI is remembered with a mix of pity and irony. He wasn't a monster, but history casts him as a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime, and his death remains one of the most famous royal executions in written history.
Marie Antoinette. Few royal deaths are as iconic or as humiliating as Marie Antoinette's. Once the most glamorous queen in Europe, she ended her life being carted through the streets of Paris in front of a jeering crowd headed for the guillotine. Marie Antoinette was just 14 when she married the future Louis XVI and became Dauphine of France. She was Austrian-born, beautiful, and instantly the target of gossip at the French court. Over time, she developed a reputation, fair or not, for extravagance, parties, and spending, while the country slipped into financial ruin. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," though she almost certainly never said it, became forever attached to her name. When the French Revolution broke out, Marie Antoinette became the lightning rod for public anger. While her husband was seen as weak and indecisive, she was portrayed as scheming, foreign, and indifferent to the suffering of the people. Revolutionary newspapers gave her cruel nicknames like Madame Deficit, mocking her for supposedly bankrupting the country. After the monarchy was abolished, Marie Antoinette was imprisoned with her family in the Temple prison. Her husband was executed in January 1793, and later that year she was put on trial herself. The charges against her were harsh: conspiring with foreign powers, depleting the treasury, even an outrageous and likely fabricated accusation of incest with her young son. The trial was a foregone conclusion. On October 16, 1793, she was sentenced to death. Unlike her husband, who had been taken to the guillotine in a closed carriage, Marie Antoinette was forced to ride to her execution in an open cart, exposed to the mobs of Paris. This was a deliberate humiliation. Crowds lined the streets, shouting insults and spitting at her as she passed. The queen, now pale and thin after months in prison, wore a plain white dress and kept her head held high. Witnesses said she remained calm and dignified, even as the people who had once cheered her at Versailles now screamed for her death. When she reached the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and famously said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." Those would be her last words. Moments later, the blade fell, and the Queen of France was gone. For the revolutionaries, her death was symbolic, the end of the old order, the final severing of monarchy from the people. But for Marie Antoinette, it was the ultimate humiliation, paraded through the streets like a criminal, publicly mocked, and executed before a roaring crowd. Today, she's remembered as both a villain and a victim, a queen who lived in luxury, but faced her end with courage. Her ride to the guillotine remains one of the most haunting images of the French Revolution, a moment where the fall of a crown became a public spectacle.
Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie was one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century, a man who went from being revered as a near-divine emperor to dying quietly under house arrest, allegedly smothered with a pillow. His story is both inspiring and deeply tragic. Haile Selassie ruled Ethiopia from 1930 until 1974, though he had actually been at the center of power since the 1910s. He was known for modernizing Ethiopia, joining the League of Nations, and famously appealing to the world when Italy invaded his country in 1935. His defiant speech in Geneva made him a global symbol of resistance against fascism. During World War II, he returned triumphantly to Ethiopia with British support and reclaimed his throne. For decades, Haile Selassie was seen as a wise, almost mystical leader. To Rastafarians in Jamaica and beyond, he was literally a messianic figure, the returned Messiah foretold in prophecy. But by the 1970s, Ethiopia was facing famine, economic stagnation, and growing discontent. Many saw the emperor as increasingly out of touch. In 1974, the Derg, a Marxist military junta, staged a coup and removed Haile Selassie from power. The once great emperor was placed under house arrest in his own palace. For a man who had been treated as semi-divine for much of his life, it was a humiliating reversal. Stripped of his throne, cut off from the outside world, and kept under guard by the very soldiers who had sworn loyalty to him. A year later, on August 27, 1975, Haile Selassie was reported dead. The official story claimed that the 83-year-old emperor had died peacefully in his sleep of natural causes. But rumors immediately spread that something far darker had happened. Many believe that Haile Selassie was murdered, specifically that he was strangled or smothered with a pillow on the orders of the Derg leadership, who feared that leaving him alive might inspire a royalist counter-coup. Decades later, members of the junta were tried and convicted for their roles in his death, though the exact details remain murky. Adding to the indignity, Haile Selassie's body was buried in secret beneath the palace toilets, as if to erase his memory entirely. It wasn't until 2000, 25 years later, that his remains were reburied in a state funeral at Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie's death was the final chapter in a life that had spanned the collapse of empires, world wars, and the birth of modern Africa. To some, he died a martyr, brought down by a ruthless regime. To others, he died a symbol of a monarchy that had failed to adapt to the modern world. But what's undeniable is that his end was a quiet, lonely one. An emperor reduced to a prisoner, possibly smothered in his bed, leaving behind a legacy as complex as it is tragic.
Emperor Maximilian. Some royal deaths feel like the end of an era. Emperor Maximilian of Mexico's death felt like the end of a fantasy, and a brutal wake-up call for anyone who thought monarchy could be imported by force. Maximilian was an Austrian archduke, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I. In the 1860s, he accepted an offer that sounded too good to be true. Napoleon III of France wanted him to become Emperor of Mexico. With French military backing, Maximilian traveled across the ocean, put on a crown, and began ruling Mexico as if he could bring European-style monarchy to the Americas. The problem? Most Mexicans hadn't asked for an emperor, and certainly not one installed by a foreign power. Maximilian faced constant resistance from Mexican Republicans, led by Benito Juárez, who refused to recognize his rule.
When Napoleon III withdrew French support in 1867 under pressure from the United States, Maximilian's empire collapsed almost overnight. His army was defeated. He was captured at Querétaro and sentenced to death by firing squad. This is where Maximilian's story takes a strange turn. Despite facing almost certain death, he remained calm and composed. He refused a blindfold and reportedly gave money to his executioners so they would aim true and end his suffering quickly. Then he made a grand speech, his romantic farewell to the Mexican people. Depending on which account you read, his last words were something like, "I forgive everyone, and I pray that my blood may be the last shed for the good of this country. Viva Mexico! Viva la independencia!" It was noble, it was dramatic, and for some, it was ridiculous. Critics mocked it as sentimental, overly theatrical, and out of touch, as if Maximilian still believed he was the hero of some grand opera, rather than a failed ruler about to be executed. Then came the moment itself. Maximilian stretched out his arms in the shape of a cross, an almost Christ-like pose, and shouted, "Aim at my heart." The soldiers fired, and the self-proclaimed Emperor of Mexico was dead at just 34 years old. News of his death shocked Europe. To monarchists, Maximilian was a martyr, a tragic idealist killed by revolutionaries. To Republicans, his death was justice, the final rejection of foreign-imposed monarchy. Either way, his execution marked the definitive end of the so-called Second Mexican Empire. Today, Maximilian is remembered as a man caught between worlds, a European aristocrat who wanted to be a liberal, enlightened ruler, but was fatally naive about the politics of the country he tried to govern. His death by firing squad remains one of the most famous royal executions of the 19th century, all at once tragic, heroic, and just a little bit theatrical.
King Charles I. Few royal deaths were as world-shaking or as humiliating as the execution of King Charles I of England. This wasn't just a king dying. It was the literal beheading of the idea that monarchs ruled by divine right. Charles I had ruled England, Scotland, and Ireland since 1625, and he was a firm believer that kings were chosen by God and therefore answered to no one but him. This was not a popular opinion among Parliament, who wanted more say in how the country was governed, especially when it came to taxes and religion. Tensions between Charles and Parliament escalated until they erupted into the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, pitting royalists against parliamentarians. Charles lost, was captured, escaped, was captured again, and eventually found himself on trial for treason, something no English king had ever faced. The trial was extraordinary. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority, insisting that no court had the right to judge a king. But it didn't matter. The verdict was already decided: guilty. On January 30th, 1649, Charles was led from St. James's Palace to the banqueting house at Whitehall,
where a scaffold had been erected. A huge crowd gathered to witness the unprecedented spectacle, a king about to lose his head in public. Charles wore 2 shirts that day, reportedly so that he wouldn't shiver in the cold and be mistaken for being afraid. He gave a short speech saying he died a faithful man of the Church of England, and then laid his neck calmly on the block. The executioner's axe fell in a single clean stroke, severing the king's head. The executioner then held the head aloft for the crowd to see, a gesture meant to prove that the king was truly dead. According to eyewitnesses, there was a stunned silence before the crowd let out a collective groan. It was the ultimate humiliation for a man who believed so strongly in the divine right of kings. Not only had Charles been tried and condemned by his own subjects, but his death was made a public spectacle, a message to the world that no one, not even a king, was above the law. Charles's execution sent shockwaves through Europe. Other monarchs were horrified. If it could happen in England, could it happen elsewhere? For 11 years, England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell, before the monarchy was eventually restored in 1660. But even after the crown returned, Charles's death remained a powerful symbol. To royalists, he became a martyr, the king over the water, who died for his principles. To Republicans, he was proof that tyrants could be brought to justice. Either way, his beheading marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new idea about power, that even kings could be held accountable, even if it meant taking off their heads.